Ida B. Wells was born in 1862 in the quiet town of Holly Springs, Mississippi, a place that would become the backdrop to some of the most poignant moments of her remarkable life. The world she entered was one of great transformation, where the echoes of slavery still shaped the lives of many African Americans in the South, and the struggle for equality was beginning to take its earliest forms. Ida, born into a world where injustice ran deep, would grow to become one of the most powerful voices against the racial violence and discrimination of her time. Her story is one of resilience, courage, and unwavering conviction. Through her work as a journalist, activist, and educator, she not only challenged the status quo but laid the foundation for generations of activists who would follow in her footsteps. Her efforts to expose the horrors of lynching, her calls for the rights of black women, and her persistent pursuit of justice carved a path for the civil rights movement that would come decades later. As we drift through her life, from her early days in Mississippi to her final years in Chicago, we will see the quiet power of a woman who understood that truth, no matter how difficult, must be told. Her legacy is one of profound change, a change that reverberates through history, still echoing today. Before we begin, if you enjoy this journey through history, consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you're listening from. Now, let us slowly turn the pages of Ida B. Wells' extraordinary life. Ida Bell Wells, born in 1862, was the first child of James and Elizabeth Wells. Her parents, both born into slavery, were fiercely determined to see their children live in a world where racial injustice no longer had a hold on the black community. James Wells was a carpenter, and Elizabeth was a schoolteacher, a rare and invaluable skill for a woman of African descent in that time. Though her family's means were modest, they were deeply rooted in the values of education and community activism. Ida's early years unfolded in the shadow of the Civil War, a period of national upheaval and promise. Mississippi, a state at the heart of the Confederacy, was gradually shifting as the tides of war pushed toward the abolition of slavery. For much of her early life, Ida's world was defined by the lingering effects of the institution her family had just escaped. In these formative years, the country was reckoning with freedom for black Americans, but the fruits of liberty were not easily accessible. The bitter legacy of slavery remained in the segregated and prejudiced structures that defined the South's social and economic life. Ida's family, despite being free, lived in constant awareness of the ways in which the white community controlled black life. The oppressive atmosphere of the time would come to define much of Ida's path in life. At a young age, she was already becoming acutely aware of the strictures of race and the constraints of societal expectations for African Americans. These early experiences, filled with hardship but also with resolve, were to shape her understanding of the world and her deep-rooted commitment to the rights of black people. In 1878, when Ida was only 16, tragedy struck. A yellow fever epidemic swept through Holly Springs, claiming the lives of both of her parents, leaving Ida and her 5 siblings orphaned. This devastating loss, while heartbreaking, also marked a critical turning point in her life. Her mother, who had worked tirelessly to instill in her children a sense of pride and determination, had taught Ida the value of self-reliance and the necessity of standing firm in the face of adversity. With no parents to turn to, Ida assumed responsibility for her siblings and took on the role of their protector. Having grown up surrounded by strong role models, Ida knew that the path forward required resilience. At the time of her parents' death, she was already well aware of the limitations placed on black people in the South. Education, though hard-won, was still an available route for advancement, even in a deeply segregated society. Ida, now ever the fighter, chose to continue her education despite the significant challenges before her. She found a way to attend Russ College, a historically black institution, on a scholarship, and began to prepare herself for a life of activism and change. While at Rust College, Ida began to come into her own, forging the intellectual foundation for what would become her lifelong fight against racial injustice. She excelled academically, though financial and personal struggles often hindered her studies. In these early days, she became inspired by the stories of black resistance to slavery and segregation, and the idea that a well-educated person could influence change became her guiding principle. In 1880, with no support beyond her determination and intellect, Ida left Rust College and moved to Memphis, Tennessee. It was there that she took up the work of a teacher. Her role in the classroom was vital not just for the education she provided, but as an act of defiance against a system that sought to suppress the intellectual development of black people. As a teacher, Wells was able to engage directly with her community, but her work was just beginning. The Memphis she arrived in was a city still steeped in the realities of the South's racial divide. While teaching, Ida became involved in the movement to challenge segregation in Memphis. It was in 1884, when she was about 22, that she boarded a train and was forcibly removed from a segregated railroad car. Wells had purchased a first-class ticket, believing that the rules of segregation were not to apply to her. Her refusal to vacate the train car and the subsequent humiliating removal ignited a deep sense of injustice. It was a turning point, and Wells resolved to fight against the systems of racial oppression with every ounce of her being. Ida B. Wells' early life was defined by hardship, but it was also defined by resilience, intelligence, and a deep sense of justice. The loss of her parents forced her to mature quickly, but it also ignited her commitment to a life of activism and advocacy for racial equality. Even in the face of personal loss and societal constraints, she maintained an unwavering belief in the power of education, the dignity of black people, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Her story is one of a woman determined to break through the oppressive structures of her time. From her early education in Holly Springs to her experiences in Memphis, Ida B. socked. Wells' journey had only just begun. The struggles and challenges of her early life shaped the activist she would become, and the fire that burned within her would eventually lead her to one of the most important and dangerous battles of the 20th century, the fight against lynching. The seeds of that battle were being planted even in these early years, and the determination she developed as a young woman would sustain her throughout her lifetime. Ida B. Wells' life took a harrowing turn in the summer of 1878 when she was just 16 years old. The death of her parents, James and Elizabeth Wells, due to a devastating yellow fever epidemic in Holly Springs, Mississippi, marked a tragic moment that would forever alter the course of her life. In the blink of an eye, she went from being a daughter in a supportive and in a hard-working family to becoming the head of her household, tasked with the responsibility of raising her 5 younger siblings. Her father, a carpenter, had been a pillar of the community, advocating for the rights and dignity of African Americans. Her mother, a school teacher, was just as committed to ensuring that her children received a proper education, instilling in them the values of hard work, respect, and resilience. They had been a team, working together to ensure that their children had a chance at something more, an opportunity to rise above the oppressive social conditions of the South. However, their untimely deaths meant that Ida, though only a teenager herself, had to step into a role far beyond her years. The sudden loss was incomprehensible, and the weight of responsibility was immense. Stacey Wells was forced to mature quickly and learn to navigate a world that was cruel and unyielding, especially toward black people. The deaths of her parents left her grieving, but they also hardened her resolve. In a world that continually sought to break black families apart, Ida refused to let her family fall apart as well. She understood that her siblings needed her to be strong, and she found the strength to take on this monumental responsibility. As an orphan, Yeda found herself in a situation that many young black women of the time would have found impossible. With the support of her community, Wells assumed the role of caretaker and protector. She found work as a school teacher, though the pay was meagre, and often had to balance her own needs with those of her younger siblings. Despite the severe financial constraints she faced, Wells remained determined to provide the education and opportunities that her parents had dreamed of for their children. While this was a time of immense hardship, it also marked the moment when Wells began to forge the unshakable independence that would define much of her later activism. Her life became about survival, but also about ensuring that her siblings had access to a future that was brighter and more just. It was not just a personal fight for survival, it was a fight for dignity and respect in a world that was systematically designed to deny those things to black people, particularly women. During this difficult time, Wells faced countless obstacles, both as an African-American woman and as an orphan. She struggled to secure work in a deeply segregated society, where black women were often excluded from many of the higher-paying jobs available to their white counterparts. Still, she was able to find work as a teacher, a position that not only gave her financial stability, but also served as an avenue for her to directly affect the lives of young black children in the community. Her role as a teacher was about more than simply imparting knowledge. It was about setting an example, teaching young minds the value of education and self-determination. Wells knew the power of education to change lives, having been deeply influenced by the lessons she learned from her parents and from her time at Russ College. In a society that sought to confine African Americans to a place of subjugation, education was one of the few means of liberation. And Wells was committed to making sure that her students understood this and carried it with them as they navigated their own lives. Yet, despite her determination and tireless work, the challenge of caring for her siblings remained an ever-present struggle. Wells did not have the luxury of pursuing her own ambitions without the burden of responsibility. Her devotion to her family and her community was the driving force behind her actions, but it was also a sacrifice. She worked long hours to support her siblings, taking on multiple jobs, and rarely had time to focus on her personal dreams or desires. Her life had shifted from one of youthful potential to one of unyielding duty. But through it all, she never wavered. It was during this period that Wells' commitment to racial justice began to take root more firmly. As she worked with young black students, Wells saw firsthand the impact of segregation and racial injustice on their lives. The very system that had oppressed her family for so long was now working to diminish the opportunities for the next generation of black children. Wells saw how they were denied the education and the opportunities that were so readily available to their white counterparts. Her empathy for them, and for the struggles of black Americans across the South, pushed her to continue her education despite the difficulties she faced. This period of personal loss and responsibility also helped Wells develop the resilience and fortitude that would serve her throughout her life. The same qualities that helped her care for her siblings in the wake of her parents' deaths would later drive her to become one of the most important activists of her time. She would not be broken by the challenges of life. She would face them head-on, with the strength of character and the sense of justice that her parents had instilled in her. The loss of her parents, while deeply painful, served as a turning point in Wells' life. It marked the end of one chapter, but the beginning of another, one in which she would not only advocate for the welfare of her family, but also fight for the dignity and rights of all African Americans. It would be in the face of personal hardship that Wells' resolve would become unbreakable. She would go on to challenge the systems that sought to dehumanize and oppress black people, determined to bring the injustices of the world to light and to make change happen. In the quiet aftermath of tragedy, Ida B. Wells began to forge the path that would lead her to become one of the most courageous and influential figures in American history. The journey was difficult, but it was also the beginning of something much larger. From the loss of her parents to the determination she found in their absence, Wells was about to begin her lifelong fight for justice and equality, a fight that would echo through history. After the loss of her parents, Ida B. Wells was determined to carve out a future for herself and her siblings, despite the deep obstacles that stood before her. In a society that sought to suppress the educational opportunities of African Americans, Wells understood that education was the key to changing her circumstances, as well as those of her community. She knew the power of knowledge, having witnessed firsthand the sacrifices her parents made to ensure that their children had access to it. But her path would not be easy. In the fall of 1879, Wells enrolled at Russ College in Holly Springs, Mississippi. The college, founded after the Civil War, was one of the few educational institutions offering higher learning to African Americans. While attending, she studied subjects like math, literature, and history, which were important not only for her personal growth, but also for the advancement of the broader African American community. Wells was determined to excel, despite the limited resources available to her as a black student in the South. Rust College was a safe haven for Wells, a place where she could pursue her intellectual ambitions without the overt racial hostility she would later encounter in the outside world. But even within the walls of this institution, Wells faced the weight of systemic oppression. The school was underfunded and lacked many of the resources that would have been available at white institutions. Yet, despite the limited resources, Wells excelled academically. Her sharp mind and unrelenting drive helped her navigate the difficulties of her education, even when personal tragedy and societal pressures threatened to hinder her progress. While attending Russ College, Wells' worldview began to expand. She became more aware of the racial injustices that were widespread in her community and the South as a whole. At a time when racial segregation and disenfranchisement were entrenched in Southern life, Wells found herself increasingly disturbed by the discrimination that Black Americans faced, particularly the way the education system sought to limit opportunities for her and her peers. This realization would lay the foundation for her future activism, as she recognized that her education had to be used for a higher purpose, to advocate for the rights of black people and to challenge the forces that sought to suppress them. However, Wells' time at Russ College was cut short. In 1880, after her parents' deaths, Wells was forced to leave school and assume responsibility for her younger siblings. Her dream of finishing her education at Russ College was dashed, but her commitment to education and the fight for justice never wavered, and even without formal schooling she sought out ways to continue her education, reading widely and staying informed about the political and social movements of the day. It was this self-directed learning that would prepare her for the life of activism that lay ahead. In the absence of a traditional education, Wells turned to her writing as a means of advocacy. She returned to Holly Springs and began to work as a teacher, a role that would serve as her introduction to the broader world of social activism. Teaching was not just a means of earning a living, it was an opportunity to influence the next generation. Wells quickly became known for her uncompromising stance on education. She believed that education was the most powerful weapon for social change, and she instilled this belief in her students, urging them to embrace learning as a way to challenge the systemic inequalities that define their lives. Wells' work as a teacher took her to Memphis, Tennessee, where she found a new community and a new set of challenges. In Memphis, Wells continued to advocate for the rights of Black Americans, and it was here that her journalistic career would begin. Memphis, though a city with a large black population, was still a place where racial tension was high. It was a city where segregation was the norm, and the rights of African Americans were continually undermined. Wells' commitment to social justice deepened in this environment, as she became more aware of the brutality of racial violence in the South, particularly lynching. Her experiences as a teacher in Memphis also sharpened her understanding of the importance of race and class in shaping the lives of Black Americans. She observed firsthand how Black children were treated differently than their white counterparts, both in school and in society. This made her even more determined to challenge the status quo. In the classroom, Wells was an advocate for the empowerment of her students, teaching them not just academic subjects but also the values of self-respect, dignity, and resistance. Her work as a teacher was an extension of her growing belief that education was essential for the liberation of Black people. It was during this time that Wells began to explore journalism as a means of amplifying her voice. Her first article appeared in 1884 in a Memphis newspaper called the Evening Star. The article critiqued the segregated streetcar system in the city, a reflection of her deep frustration with the way Black people were treated in public spaces. The article was well received, and it marked the beginning of Wells' career as a writer and journalist. She would go on to use journalism as her primary tool for social change, exposing the realities of racism, segregation, and violence in the South. Wells' early journalistic work was a reflection of her belief that the truth must be spoken, even when it is uncomfortable. She used her writing as a weapon against injustice, and she quickly became known for her uncompromising stance on issues of race and equality. Her experiences as a teacher had given her a deep understanding of the struggles of Black people in the South, and her writing would become an extension of her advocacy for their rights. By the late 1880s, Wells had firmly committed herself to a career in journalism and activism. Her work as a teacher had given her a strong foundation in the importance of education and community involvement, and it had shaped her into a person who was not afraid to confront injustice head-on. The next step in her journey was clear. She would use her writing to expose the social and racial issues of her time and to demand accountability for the violence and discrimination faced by Black Americans. Wells' early career in Memphis marked the beginning of a lifelong commitment to fighting for the rights of Black Americans, using both education and journalism as tools for social change. Her career as a writer and activist would eventually bring her national prominence, but her roots were firmly planted in the classrooms of Memphis, where she began to shape her vision of a more just society. By the late 1880s, Ida B. Wells had transitioned from a teacher to a committed activist and journalist. Her life in Memphis, Tennessee, brought her face to face with the harsh realities of racial injustice, particularly the practice of lynching, which was spreading like wildfire across the South. She'd already seen firsthand the inequities and violence that Black people faced, but it was the deeply personal experience of witnessing the lynching of 3 Black men in Memphis that would ignite her lifelong crusade against racial violence. In 1892, the lynching of 3 men, Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, shocked the community and set Wells on a path that would change the course of her life. The men, who owned a grocery store, had been accused of competing with a white-owned business and were brutally murdered by a mob of white residents. Their deaths were part of a growing trend of mob violence aimed at Black men who were seen as threats to white economic or social power. The lynching deeply troubled Wells, but it also filled her with a sense of urgency. Unlike many other Black residents of Memphis, Wells refused to remain silent about the injustice. She began to investigate the circumstances surrounding the murders, seeking to uncover the truth about what had happened. Wells, who had already written critically about racial segregation and discrimination in the past, turned her pen to this gruesome subject with determination and resolve. Her journalistic investigation into the lynching marked the beginning of her tireless campaign to expose the brutality of lynching in the South. She wrote an editorial for the Memphis Free Speech, a Black-owned newspaper where she was an editor, denouncing the murder of the 3 men and calling for justice. Wells argued that the practice of lynching was not just a response to the alleged crimes of the victims, but a way to terrorize black communities and maintain white supremacy. Her editorial was a courageous stand, especially considering the climate of fear that surrounded the practice of lynching. At the time, lynching was justified by white society under the pretense of protecting women from black men, who were often falsely accused of assaulting white women. This rationale was deeply entrenched in the culture of the South, where racism was institutionalized in every facet of life. But Wells was unafraid to challenge this false narrative. The reaction to Wells' editorial was swift and violent. White supremacists in Memphis were enraged by her outspoken condemnation of lynching. In retaliation, the offices of the Memphis Free Speech were destroyed by a mob, forcing Wells to flee for her life. This act of violence only deepened Wells' resolve to continue her fight for justice. Rather than silence her, the destruction of her press made her more determined than ever to bring the issue of lynching to national attention. Wells's response to this attack was to leave Memphis and continue her campaign against lynching from the North. She moved to Chicago, where she could operate more freely and without fear of physical retaliation. Her work, however, had only just begun. Wells' commitment to exposing the truth about lynching took on new urgency as she began to travel the country, collecting stories from survivors and documenting the widespread nature of the violence. She knew that in order to effect change, she needed to show the world the brutal reality of lynching and its impact on black communities. During her time in the North, Wells published a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, 1892, in which she carefully detailed the prevalence of lynching throughout the South. The pamphlet was a powerful and damning critique of the practice, offering evidence that contradicted the justification that lynchings were a response to white women's accusations. Wells presented evidence that most lynching victims were men who had been accused of crimes without due process or any legitimate proof of their guilt. The publication of this pamphlet marked a turning point in Wells' activism. It brought her into the national spotlight, earning her a reputation as one of the leading voices against lynching. The pamphlet was widely circulated, and Wells travelled across the country to lecture on the subject. She spoke before African American organizations, women's groups, and civil rights leaders, emphasizing the need for a concerted effort to end the practice of lynching and to push for legal reforms. She also advocated for the creation of an anti-lynching movement, which would work to raise awareness and demand that Congress pass laws to protect African Americans from mob violence. Wells was one of the first to frame lynching as a national issue rather than a local one. She understood that in order to stop lynching, it would require the collective efforts of both black and white Americans to challenge the cultural and legal structures that allowed such violence to persist. Her activism against lynching led her to become an outspoken critic of the white media, which often ignored or downplayed the scale of racial violence in the South. In her writing, Wells called out the hypocrisy of white journalists who were complicit in perpetuating the lie that lynching was a necessary evil. Wells also made sure to highlight the voices of black women, who were often left out of discussions about racial violence. She emphasized the intersection of race and gender, while calling attention to the ways in which black women were subjected to both racial and gender-based violence in the South. Wells was an early advocate for women's rights, and she believed that the liberation of black women was integral to the broader struggle for racial justice. Wells' courage and determination to expose the reality of lynching made her a target of hatred and violence, but it also earned her the admiration of countless individuals who were inspired by her unflinching commitment to justice. Her activism set the stage for future generations of civil rights leaders, and her work remains an essential part of the history of the fight against racial violence and injustice in America. By the time Wells left Memphis, she had already become one of the most important voices in the fight against racial violence. She would go on to become a pivotal figure in the larger civil rights movement, known for her tireless work, her journalistic integrity, and her unwavering commitment to social justice. Her early activism, sparked by the lynching of 3 men in Memphis, would lead her to become one of the most influential figures in American history, whose work continues to inspire movements for justice and equality today. Ida B. Wells' crusade against racial violence did not begin and end with lynching. Her activism extended beyond just exposing the brutal practice of mob killings. It was deeply intertwined with her tireless efforts to challenge the pervasive systems of segregation that governed Southern life. As an educator and journalist, Wells was increasingly disillusioned with the state of race relations in the South, and her anger at the injustice she witnessed only deepened as she observed the discrimination and subjugation of black people across the United States. After her time in Memphis, where her newspaper, The Free Speech, was destroyed for her bold stand against lynching, Wells moved to Chicago seeking a new platform for her activism. It was in Chicago, a bustling city with a large black population, that Wells would further amplify her voice, criticizing not only lynching, but also segregation in its many forms, including the racial segregation of public facilities, schools, and transportation. One of the earliest manifestations of this activism in Chicago occurred when Wells encountered the injustice of segregated streetcars. Having experienced firsthand the brutal realities of racial segregation during her time in the South, she knew that black people in the North were not immune to its effects. In 1884, while travelling on a streetcar in Memphis, Wells had been forcibly removed from the whites-only car after she refused to relinquish her seat, despite having paid for a first-class ticket. This incident, which had ignited her anger and led to her first foray into anti-segregation activism, marked a pivotal moment in her life. Now, in Chicago, she continued her efforts to expose and confront similar discrimination. In her journalistic work, Wells began writing articles that targeted segregation in all its forms. She used her platform to challenge the status quo and fight for the rights of black Americans, calling attention to the systemic disenfranchisement of black people in all spheres of life, from voting to schooling to transportation. Wells wrote not only about the violence that targeted black men, but also about the everyday forms of segregation that demeaned black people. She was particularly vocal about the way that the public transportation system often humiliated black passengers, forcing them into substandard conditions. Her writings found a sympathetic audience among black residents of Chicago, who were eager to hear from someone who would speak so unapologetically about the realities of racial injustice. Yet, her critiques of segregation went beyond local issues in Chicago. Wells became increasingly outspoken about the nationwide systems of segregation that permeated the southern states and extended their influence into the North as well. She took the message of racial equality to audiences across the country, boldly stating that segregation was not just a regional issue but a national one, requiring nationwide action and reform. In 1892, she wrote a significant editorial in The Free Speech, which called for action against segregation. Wells' appeal was simple but powerful. She urged black Americans to resist segregation through non-violent means and to demand their rights as full citizens of the United States. She also called upon black women to join her in this struggle, as she believed their voices were vital in challenging both racial and gendered oppression. She understood that black women, in particular, faced a unique form of injustice, one that was shaped by both their race and their gender, and she dedicated much of her activism to addressing their plight. Her advocacy for black women led her to become an early member of the women's suffrage movement. While Wells was not alone in her belief that black women should have the right to vote, her commitment to including the experiences of African American women in the suffrage movement made her an influential figure in the cause. She travelled to national conventions, speaking out against the exclusion of black women from the suffrage movement and demanding that the movement address the specific concerns of African American women. At the time, many of the leading suffragists, particularly in the North, were hesitant to include black women. fearing that doing so would alienate white Southern women who were critical of black enfranchisement. Wells, however, made it clear that the suffrage movement could not afford to leave black women behind. In her push for social change, Wells also criticized the church's complacency towards segregation. Despite the church's claims to moral authority, Wells observed that many churches, particularly those in the South, either supported or were indifferent to the practice of segregation. She argued that religious leaders and institutions needed to speak out against segregation and work toward a more just and equitable society for all. She saw the failure of the church to take a stand as a significant moral failing, one that helped perpetuate racial injustice. Her call for moral leadership was a call not only to the African American community, but to society at large. As a journalist, Wells became a powerful voice in the fight against racial inequality, and her articles, pamphlets, and speeches served as a direct challenge to the prevailing ideologies of white supremacy. Her writing consistently exposed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to support freedom and equality while simultaneously upholding racial segregation. But Wells' activism was not just intellectual, it was also deeply personal. She understood that change would not come easily, and she put her own safety on the line time and again to expose the truth and challenge the systems of power. Throughout her activism, Wells emphasized the importance of black unity and collective action. She believed that black Americans had the power to demand justice and achieve change, but only if they worked together. She saw the establishment of institutions like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which would later emerge in the early 20th century as part of the broader movement to address the injustices faced by black people. Though she was not directly involved in the founding of the NAACP, her work laid the groundwork for the organization's mission. Wells' dedication to fighting segregation continued throughout her life, even as the political landscape of the United States changed. She became a key figure in the early civil rights movement, advocating for a more inclusive society where the rights of African Americans, women, and marginalized groups would be respected. Her uncompromising stance against segregation and her willingness to speak truth to power earned her the respect of future generations of activists who would build upon her legacy in their own struggles for racial justice. As Ida B. or Wells ventured deeper into her work as an activist, one issue would come to define her legacy: lynching. By the time she began her crusade, lynching had become a widespread and violent tool used to control and intimidate black communities across the South. While this violence had been going on for years, it was Wells who took it upon herself to challenge the brutal system of racial violence head-on, risking her life in the process. Her dedication to the fight against lynching was one of the most defining aspects of her career. The turning point in Wells' campaign against lynching came after the lynching of 3 African American men, Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, in Memphis, Tennessee, in 1892. Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were co-owners of a grocery store, and they were accused of competing with a white-owned business. Yet this accusation, though based on economic rivalry rather than any real criminal act, was enough to spark a mob of white men to kill them. The men were dragged from their homes, tortured, and murdered in cold blood. This tragic event shattered Wells and spurred her into action. What set Wells apart from others who may have simply mourned the loss of life was her resolve to expose the reality of lynching, not just as isolated acts of violence, but as a systematic form of social control and terror. The idea that these men could be killed with impunity simply because of their economic success was an affront to the concept of justice. Wells, always deeply committed to truth, decided that silence was no longer an option. She began investigating the circumstances surrounding the murders, and speaking with witnesses and gathering evidence to understand the motivations behind the lynching. she discovered that the white community in Memphis had justified the killings by claiming the men had attacked a white woman. However, after a careful investigation, Wells found no evidence to support this claim. Instead, it became clear that the men were targeted because of their success in business, a success that threatened the status quo of white economic power. Wells wrote a scathing editorial for the Free Speech, the black-owned newspaper where she worked. She condemned the lynching, calling attention to the fact that such killings were not only unjust, but also part of a larger pattern of racial violence aimed at controlling black people's lives. Wells did not shy away from naming the perpetrators, and she condemned the silence of the white community who allowed such violence to persist without protest. She used her position as a journalist to bring attention to this glaring injustice, and her words struck a chord with many who were living in fear of such violence. Her editorial, however, did not go unnoticed by the perpetrators of this violence. In fact, it was met with hostility. The office of the Free Speech was destroyed by a white mob, and Wells, fearing for her life, was forced to flee Memphis. She left behind not only the city she'd called home for so long, but also the work she'd spent years building. Wells, however, refused to let this setback end her fight. Instead, she made the decision to continue her advocacy from a safer location. Wells moved to Chicago, a city where her voice could be heard without the constant threat of violence hanging over her head. But even in the relative safety of Chicago, her mission remained unchanged: to expose the truth about lynching and to seek justice for the victims of such violence. She began traveling the country, gathering stories of survivors and writing articles that would shed light on the truth behind the brutal and unjust practice of lynching. One of her most significant works during this period was the pamphlet Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, published in 1892. In this pamphlet, Wells used her research to challenge the prevailing narrative surrounding lynching. She debunked the myth that lynchings were conducted to protect white women from black men, thus demonstrating that many black men who were lynched had been falsely accused of crimes. Often the victims of lynching were not rapists or murderers, but men who had crossed economic, social or political boundaries that white society deemed unacceptable. Wells used her platform not only to expose the horrors of lynching, but also to rally people to demand action. She called for the passage of federal anti-lynching laws and worked tirelessly to raise awareness of the need for justice. Though she faced intense opposition, including from white supremacist groups and some members of the black community who feared retribution, Wells' commitment never wavered. Her activism helped bring the issue of lynching to national attention, and her efforts would eventually lead to the creation of organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which continued the fight for civil rights in the decades that followed. Wells also made sure to take her message abroad. Her campaign against lynching reached an international audience when she travelled to Britain to speak about the issue. There, she was met with strong support from both black and white allies, and she gained international attention for the cause. She was able to garner public outrage over the practice of lynching, and used her position to speak to a global audience about the need for racial justice in America. Though Wells' efforts were groundbreaking, and her work was widely praised by those who shared her commitment to justice, she also faced significant criticism. Many white Americans, particularly in the South, refused to acknowledge the truth of Wells' findings and continued to justify lynching as a form of retribution. They labelled her as an agitator, and her voice was marginalised by those who wanted to maintain the status quo. Even some in the black community, who feared for their safety, criticised Wells for speaking out so publicly about such a controversial issue. But Wells was undeterred. She saw the work she was doing not as just a fight for justice for the victims of lynching, but as a broader fight for the dignity and rights of black Americans. For Wells, this was a fight for the very soul of the nation, a fight to ensure that justice was available to all, regardless of race. And while her work was often met with hostility, her impact cannot be overstated. The work she did in exposing the truth about lynching laid the groundwork for future civil rights movements, and her legacy as one of the foremost early advocates for racial justice continues to resonate today. Wells' commitment to justice, even in the face of great personal risk, was one of the defining characteristics of her activism. She understood that the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, had to be told. And in telling that truth, she helped to change the course of history. Ida B. Wells' journey into the world of journalism was born out of necessity, personal tragedy, and an unwavering commitment to the truth. As an editor and writer for the Free Speech, a black-owned newspaper in Memphis, Wells had a platform that allowed her to challenge the status quo, speak to the African American community, and confront the injustices of her time. But being an outspoken black woman in the segregated South was fraught with risk, and her commitment to exposing the truth about lynching and racial violence brought her into direct conflict with both white supremacists and some members of her own community. The work she did at the Free Speech was pioneering, both in its bold critique of the racial climate of the South and in its commitment to providing a voice for Black Americans in a time when their voices were often silenced or ignored. Wells had taken the reins of the paper in the early 1890s, and from the start she used it as a vehicle for social change. She used her writing to document the brutal realities of life for African Americans in the South, especially the horrors of lynching, and to challenge the systemic racism that defined Southern society. Wells' editorials focused on a range of issues, from the unfair treatment of black people in the legal system to the economic exploitation of black farmers. However, it was her uncompromising stance on lynching that set her apart and brought her both national and international attention. Her editorial style was direct and unapologetic, and her courage in confronting such a dangerous subject made her a target of both public scorn and violent retribution. In 1892, just a few months after she wrote the editorial denouncing the lynching of Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell and Will Stewart, the Free Speech office was destroyed by a white mob. The attack was a direct response to Wells' condemnation of lynching, and it was a reminder of the high price of speaking out against the deeply entrenched system of racial violence. Wells' life was in danger, and she was forced to leave Memphis to escape further harm. Though the destruction of her press was a blow, Wells did not let it deter her. Instead, she moved to Chicago, where she could continue her work without the immediate threat of violence. But her departure from Memphis was not just a physical escape. It marked the beginning of a new phase in her activism. She knew that her work had only just begun, and she was determined to continue her efforts to expose the truth about lynching and racial violence on a broader stage. While in Chicago, Wells continued her writing and became an even more vocal advocate for the rights of African Americans. Her journalism reached a wider audience, and her work was published in newspapers across the country. But it wasn't just her writing that made an impact. It was her ability to mobilize people, to speak to both black and white communities about the need for justice and to demand change. She took her message to the streets, to conventions, and to meetings with political leaders, where she tirelessly advocated for anti-lynching legislation and greater civil rights protections for African Americans. Despite her growing prominence, Wells' personal life continued to be fraught with struggles. In 1895, she married Ferdinand Barnett, a prominent African American attorney and editor, and together they had 4 children. Wells was now balancing her demanding career with her responsibilities as a wife and mother. The challenges of maintaining a family while also fighting for racial justice were significant, and Wells often found herself stretched thin between the demands of her activism and her personal life. Nevertheless, she managed to maintain her fierce dedication to both. In addition to her family responsibilities, Wells faced numerous personal challenges in her marriage. Barnett, while supportive of Wells' activism, was sometimes frustrated with her uncompromising stance and the danger it brought to their family. Wells' activism often put her at odds with those around her, and at times she struggled to reconcile her public life with her private one. The emotional toll of being constantly under threat, of risking her safety to pursue justice, weighed heavily on her, and yet she never wavered in her commitment to the cause. Her marriage also highlighted a significant tension in Wells's life, her belief in the importance of women's rights. Wells was an advocate for women's suffrage and gender equality, and she was particularly outspoken about the need for black women to have a voice in the fight for civil rights. She frequently challenged the suffrage movement to be more inclusive, arguing that black women too should be granted the right to vote. But this belief sometimes put her at odds with other activists, including her husband, who felt that Wells' feminist views were too radical for the time. Despite the personal and professional challenges she faced, Wells' work continued to make an indelible mark on the fight for racial justice. She was recognized as one of the most important voices in the early civil rights movement, such that her work inspired countless others to join the cause. In the years following her departure from Memphis, Wells traveled widely, giving speeches and writing articles that addressed the systemic racism in both the North and South. Her influence extended beyond the United States. She spoke to international audiences, raising awareness about the issue of lynching and the plight of African Americans. The work Wells did at the Free Speech and her commitment to exposing racial violence paved the way for future generations of journalists and activists. Her refusal to allow her voice to be silenced, despite the constant threats to her life and her family, made her one of the most courageous and important figures in American history. And though she faced tremendous personal struggles, including the destruction of her newspaper, the challenges of marriage, and the weight of her responsibilities as a mother, she remained steadfast in her mission. Ida B. Wells' time in Memphis, though marked by personal hardship and professional loss, was also a time of profound growth and transformation. It was in Memphis that she first became a journalist, and it was in Memphis that she first began to understand the power of the written word to expose injustice and demand change. Her years at the Free Speech helped to solidify her role as one of the most influential voices in the early civil rights movement, and they provided her with the platform she would use to speak truth to power for the rest of her life. By the early 1890s, Ida B. Wells had already established herself as a tenacious and fearless journalist, one whose commitment to racial justice could not be swayed by threats, intimidation, or violence. Following the destruction of the Free Speech and her subsequent relocation to Chicago, Wells began to devote herself more fully to the campaign against lynching, which had become the cornerstone of her activism. It was the lynching of 3 black men in Memphis in 1892, Tom Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, that first opened her eyes to the full scale of racial violence in the South. Their deaths, ostensibly due to competition with a white-owned business, ignited her anger and prompted her to seek justice for them through her writing. However, the more Wells investigated lynching, the more she realized that the act was not isolated to one incident or city. It was, instead, a part of a pattern of systemic violence meant to intimidate and control the black community, particularly economically successful black men. Wells understood that lynching was not simply a response to alleged crimes, it was a tool used by white supremacists to maintain dominance. The myth that lynching was a way to protect white women from black men was widespread, but Wells was one of the first to debunk it, using her investigative skills and a wealth of first-hand accounts to expose the lie. As she uncovered more evidence, she began to realize that black men were frequently lynched, for reasons that had nothing to do with crime or morality. These lynchings were often the result of black men standing up to white authority, thriving economically, or challenging the social hierarchy that kept black people in their place. This realization led Wells to launch what would become the first organized anti-lynching campaign in the United States. In 1892, she published Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, a pamphlet that exposed the lies behind the practice of lynching. Wells was clear in her condemnation of the brutality that Black Americans faced, and she directly challenged the false narrative that lynching was necessary for maintaining public order. Her pamphlet, which was a combination of investigative journalism and impassioned advocacy, marked the beginning of a national conversation about the reality of lynching in the South. Wells' courage in writing and publishing this pamphlet cannot be overstated. At the time, the South was a hotbed of racial violence, and speaking out against lynching was not only unpopular but also extremely dangerous. Wells knew that by writing about lynching she was risking her life, yet she felt that the truth was too important to remain silent. She understood that exposing the truth about lynching would not only shine a light on the injustice, but also create a platform for broader discussions about racial violence and the systemic racism that perpetuated it. After publishing Southern Horrors, Wells began to take her campaign on the road, traveling throughout the United States to give speeches and lectures about the prevalence of lynching. She did not simply recount the stories of lynching victims, she also challenged her audiences to understand the broader social and political context of these deaths. Wells argued that lynching was not just a crime against individuals but a crime against the entire Black community. It was a violent method of controlling and suppressing the Black population, one that was tolerated and, in some cases, supported by white society. Her efforts were not without opposition. Wells was met with hostility from both white supremacists and members of her own community, some of whom feared the repercussions of her outspoken advocacy. In the South, lynching was deeply entrenched in the fabric of society, and speaking out against it was seen as a threat to the established order. Yet, Wells' courage inspired others to join the fight against lynching, and her writings began to have a profound impact on the national conversation. Wells' campaign took on even greater significance when she began to work with other activists and civil rights organizations to push for anti-lynching laws. She used her platform to advocate for federal legislation that would make lynching a federal crime punishable by law. While she was unsuccessful in getting such a law passed during her lifetime, her work helped lay the foundation for future civil rights movements and set the stage for the legislative victories of the 20th century. Wells also began to focus on the importance of organizing Black Americans to take action against lynching. She recognized that the Black community needed to come together, not only to resist the violence but to demand justice from the government. She encouraged Black people to organize petitions, hold protests, and speak out against the ongoing violence. She also called on white Americans to join the cause, urging them to speak out against the systemic racism that allowed lynching to persist. One of the hallmarks of Wells' anti-lynching campaign was her ability to reach audiences across racial and regional lines. While her primary focus was on exposing the violence faced by Black Americans, she also worked to bridge the gap between Black and white activists. She understood that in order to end lynching there needed to be a unified effort, one that transcended racial boundaries. Her work as a journalist, speaker and organizer helped create a national movement that eventually became one of the cornerstones of the civil rights struggle in the United States. Despite the enormous risks she faced, Wells continued her anti-lynching work throughout her life. Her efforts not only brought attention to the issue of racial violence, but also contributed to the broader conversation about civil rights and racial equality. By focusing on lynching, Wells was able to highlight the ways in which the legal and political systems in the United States were complicit in the oppression of Black people. Her campaign for justice exposed the harsh realities of life in the South and helped galvanize the African American community to demand change. Wells' anti-lynching campaign was a pivotal moment in the history of racial justice in the United States. It marked the beginning of a broader movement to challenge the structures of racism and violence that defined the country. Though Wells was not able to achieve all of her goals in her lifetime, her work left an indelible mark on the struggle for civil rights. Her courageous stand against lynching made her one of the most important figures in the early civil rights movement, and her legacy continues to inspire those who fight for justice and equality today. In 1892, after the publication of her groundbreaking work Southern Horrors and the subsequent destruction of the free speech, Ida B. Wells was forced to leave Memphis. The violent attack on her newspaper office by a white mob left her no choice but to flee for her safety, and though it was a painful decision, it would ultimately mark a pivotal moment in Wells' life. While the loss of her newspaper was a personal blow, her exile from Memphis allowed her to broaden her influence as an activist and to continue her vital work against lynching from a safer base of operations. Wells' move to Chicago was not just a geographical shift. It represented a new chapter in her life, both professionally and personally. The city, with its burgeoning African American population, offered Wells an opportunity to continue her activism on a larger scale. She quickly became involved in Chicago's growing civil rights community, which gave her new platforms and alliances for her work. In Chicago, Wells found the space and the security to continue her writing and public speaking without the immediate threat of violence. Yet, this new environment came with its own set of challenges, both external and internal. While Wells had always been a determined and fearless advocate for justice, her exile marked the beginning of a period of personal reflection and growth. She now had the freedom to travel and speak on a national stage, sharing her message with audiences who had previously been unaware or indifferent to the horrors of lynching. Wells used her new platform to gather further evidence, conduct more interviews, and bring the stories of the victims of lynching to the attention of the public. Her activism expanded beyond the borders of the South, and she became a nationally recognized figure in the fight for civil rights. But despite her increasing influence, Wells was not immune to the emotional toll of her work. The constant threats to her safety, the weight of the stories she told, and the isolation she often felt as one of the few women in the male-dominated spheres of activism and journalism all took a personal toll. Wells' activism required an unyielding emotional and physical commitment, and she sometimes found herself torn between the demands of her public life and the needs of her personal life. In the midst of these external struggles, Wells found support from an unlikely source, her family. In 1895, Wells married Ferdinand Barnett, a prominent African-American attorney and editor of the conservative newspaper in Chicago. Barnett was a steadfast supporter of Wells' activism, and together they formed a partnership that balanced both personal and professional endeavors. While Barnett supported her work, Wells also became a mother to 4 children, which added a new layer of complexity to her already demanding life. The intersection of her family life and her activism created new tensions. Wells' role as a mother, wife, and public figure meant that she was constantly negotiating between her obligations to her family and her commitment to her work, in her personal life. She was deeply involved in the well-being of her children and was determined to create a stable home life despite the chaos that often surrounded her activism. But at the same time, she knew that the work she was doing was critical for the future of her children and the broader African American community. Her sense of duty toward her family and her community were often in conflict, yet they were also deeply intertwined. Even as she navigated these personal dynamics, Wells grew stronger as a leader and as an activist. Her voice became one of the most powerful in the fight for racial equality and justice, not just for black men, but for black women as well. She recognized that the struggles of black women were often overlooked or dismissed in discussions about civil rights, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that the voices of black women were heard. Wells' efforts to bring attention to issues such as lynching, suffrage, and the rights of black women made her a pivotal figure in the early women's rights movement, and she continued to advocate for these causes throughout her life. Her work during this period was also marked by an increasing focus on international activism. Wells travelled abroad, speaking to European audiences about the plight of black Americans, particularly focusing on the issue of lynching. Her ability to make the world aware of the racial violence in the United States helped to generate international pressure on the American government to take action. Wells' global advocacy made her an important figure in the international human rights movement, and she used her international platform to draw attention to racial injustice both at home and abroad. But despite the growth of her influence and the recognition of her work, Wells faced significant challenges within her own community. She often found herself at odds with other leaders in the African American community, particularly when it came to issues of strategy and approach. Some leaders felt that Wells' uncompromising stance on issues like lynching and racial violence was too confrontational, and they urged her to adopt a more diplomatic approach. Wells, however, remained steadfast in her belief that the truth had to be told, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient. Her willingness to speak out against the system of racial violence, even when it alienated her from some allies, was one of her defining traits. Through all the challenges she faced, personal, professional, and ideological, Wells' activism remained her driving force. The time she spent in Chicago allowed her to expand her reach and influence, but it also gave her the space to reflect on her work and her place in the broader fight for civil rights. Her exile from Memphis was not an end, but a beginning, a turning point that allowed her to continue her work, strengthen her resolve, and deepen her understanding of the complex relationship between race, gender, and power in the United States. As Wells continued her advocacy, she made it clear that her fight was not just for the victims of lynching, but for the dignity and humanity of all black people. Her work in Chicago laid the foundation for the larger civil rights movement of the 20th century. And her legacy as one of the most courageous and influential women in American history continued to grow. Ida B. Wells' move to Chicago in the early 1890s was pivotal, not only for her personal safety, but also for the expansion of her influence as a journalist and activist. From her new base, she would take her fight for racial justice and anti-lynching advocacy to a national and even international audience. With a more secure environment and a larger platform, Wells was able to galvanize support across the country and around the world, making the issue of lynching and the broader fight for civil rights impossible to ignore. In Chicago, Wells became a fixture in the growing African American community, which was finding its political voice in the face of continued segregation and disenfranchisement. The city offered Wells both a platform and a large sympathetic audience for her message. She continued to write for newspapers like the Chicago Defender, where she highlighted the systemic violence facing black Americans. But her reach soon extended beyond local publications as she took to national stages to speak on the horrors of lynching and the broader injustices suffered by African Americans. Wells became an outspoken advocate for the formation of civil rights organizations to combat lynching and racial inequality. As one of the first to bring national attention to the horrors of lynching, she was a driving force behind the creation of a larger civil rights infrastructure that would eventually lead to the formation of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, in 1909. While she did not formally join the NAACP, her work set the foundation for the organization's mission, particularly her insistence that the horrors of lynching should be central to any conversation about racial justice. Through her writing, Wells made lynching a national issue, challenging the federal government to take action. Her works, including Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and later A Red Record, 1895, were foundational in framing lynching not as an isolated issue, but as part of a larger pattern of racial violence meant to suppress African Americans and maintain white supremacy. In a Red Record, Wells examined the racial and economic motives behind lynching, showing that it was often used as a tool to eliminate competition and to instill fear in black communities. She debunked the widely accepted justifications for lynching, particularly the myth that it was a way to protect white women from black men, instead presenting the case that many lynchings occurred because black men had achieved economic success or challenged the status quo. As Wells continued her work, her writing became even more influential. Her articles, pamphlets, and books were widely circulated, and she gained the attention of major civil rights groups, including black organizations such as the National Negro Business League. She also reached out to Northern and European audiences, gaining significant support for her cause from abroad. In 1893, Wells travelled to England to address the British public about the widespread racial violence in the United States. Her efforts were successful in raising awareness, and she was able to generate significant international pressure on the US government to address the issue of lynching. During her time in Europe, Wells gave lectures, held press conferences, and participated in debates, all of which contributed to a growing international recognition of the severity of American racial violence. Wells' international speaking engagements were also an opportunity for her to highlight the hypocrisy of a country that prided itself on its democratic ideals while simultaneously allowing such brutal acts of racial violence to continue unchecked. She made clear that the situation in the United States was not just a problem for African Americans, but a moral issue that concerned people of conscience worldwide. Through her ability to move people across the globe, Wells successfully brought the issue of lynching to the attention of a much wider audience than ever before. Her time in England helped elevate her status as a leader in the international fight for racial justice. The British press gave her widespread attention, and she became a celebrated figure in the international human rights movement. Wells was able to forge powerful connections with like-minded activists and organizations in both Europe and the United States, all of whom supported her mission to expose the truth about lynching and its devastating effects on black communities. Despite the success of her international work, Wells' efforts in the United States were met with significant resistance. While she was able to gain a large following among African Americans and progressive white Americans, many Southern politicians, as well as the white press, continued to dismiss her findings. They either denied the prevalence of lynching or justified it as a necessary evil in a racially divided society. The backlash she faced, however, only fueled her resolve to continue her activism. Wells' expanding influence was not limited to her writing or public speaking. She also worked to organize boycotts and protests against the practices of lynching and racial discrimination. One of her most famous efforts in this regard was her call for a boycott of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which she criticized for failing to include African Americans in its programming. Wells highlighted how black achievements and contributions were largely ignored by the fair, and she called on African Americans to boycott the event as a form of protest against their exclusion from national recognition. Her call for the boycott was emblematic of her broader approach to activism. Wells did not simply rely on writing and speaking. She used her platform to mobilize people and take direct action against the injustices they faced. Her commitment to organizing for social change was unwavering, and her efforts to galvanize both black and white Americans in the fight against racism were some of her most important contributions. Though she faced ongoing challenges, Wells' national and international impact cannot be overstated. She was one of the first to elevate the issue of lynching to a national stage, and her tireless work to bring it to the attention of the world changed the course of the civil rights movement. Her advocacy for the rights of black people and her unflinching commitment to exposing the horrors of racial violence laid the foundation for the larger civil rights struggles that would follow in the 20th century. Wells' ability to speak truth to power, despite the immense risks she faced, cemented her legacy as one of the most important figures in American history. Ida B. Wells' activism was not confined solely to the battle against lynching and racial violence. She was also a vocal and determined advocate for the rights of women, particularly black women. At a time when both the civil rights and women's suffrage movements were gaining momentum, Wells understood that the struggles for racial equality and women's rights were deeply intertwined. She was one of the first figures to push for the inclusion of African American women in the national conversation about suffrage, insisting that black women deserved a voice in the fight for equal rights. Her work in the women's suffrage movement began during her time in Chicago, where she became involved in various social justice organizations. She was particularly active in the suffrage movement, believing that voting rights were an essential part of securing political and social equality for women. However, Wells soon realized that the suffrage movement, particularly in the North, was often racially exclusionary. Many white suffragists, especially those from the southern states, were unwilling to support the enfranchisement of black women, fearing that it would alienate white voters in the South. This racial divide within the women's suffrage movement prompted Wells to take a bold stand. She was not only advocating for women's right to vote, but also fighting against the racial segregation that pervaded the suffrage movement. She argued that black women's voices were vital to the success of the suffrage cause, and that any movement that excluded them was fundamentally flawed. Wells was determined to ensure that black women were included in the fight for women's rights, and she was not afraid to confront white suffragists who tried to sideline black women. One of her most significant contributions to the suffrage movement was her involvement in the formation of the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, in 1896. The NACW was created to provide a space for black women to organize and advocate for their rights, particularly the right to vote. Wells was a founding member of the organization and used it as a platform to push for both racial and gender equality. The NACW focused on issues such as education, public health, and civil rights, but it was also deeply committed to ensuring that black women had a seat at the table in the broader suffrage movement. Wells also became a strong voice for women's rights within the broader civil rights movement. While many civil rights leaders, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, were primarily focused on the rights of black men, Wells argued that the fight for equality had to include women, particularly black women who faced both racial and gender-based oppression. She was one of the first figures to articulate the intersectionality of race and gender, and a recognizing that the struggles of black women were unique and required a distinct approach. Wells believed that true equality could not be achieved without addressing the specific challenges faced by black women, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that their voices were heard in the fight for justice. Her commitment to women's rights was also evident in her writings. In her speeches and articles, Wells often highlighted the ways in which black women were doubly oppressed by both the racist structures of American society and the patriarchal systems that sought to silence women. She was an early feminist who understood that the fight for women's rights could not be separated from the fight for racial justice. For Wells, the two struggles were inseparable, and she worked to build alliances between women's rights groups and civil rights organizations to ensure that both issues were addressed simultaneously. Wells' advocacy for women's suffrage and her push for greater inclusion of black women in the movement often put her at odds with some of the leading figures in the suffrage movement, such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. These women, while champions of women's rights, were not always inclusive of black women in their advocacy. Many white suffragists, particularly those from the South, were hesitant to support black women's suffrage, fearing that it would alienate white voters. Wells, however, was unapologetic in her insistence that black women deserved the right to vote and that their struggles could not be ignored. Wells' refusal to accept the exclusion of black women from the suffrage movement was not only a matter of principle, but also a reflection of her broader understanding of social justice. She understood that the fight for equality could not be successful unless it was inclusive of all people, particularly those who had been marginalized the most. Her activism within the suffrage movement was deeply rooted in her belief that racial and gender equality were interdependent, and that the success of one struggle would be incomplete without the success of the other. Despite the resistance she faced, Wells's advocacy for women's suffrage and her efforts to include black women in the movement made her one of the most important voices in the early feminist movement. Her work helped lay the foundation for the future inclusion of black women in both the women's rights and civil rights movements. Although she did not live to see the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women the right to vote, Wells' efforts were integral to the eventual success of the suffrage movement. Her legacy as a feminist and civil rights leader continues to inspire generations of activists who fight for the rights of women and people of colour. Wells' involvement in the suffrage movement also highlighted the broader issues of racial inequality that pervaded both the civil rights and women's rights movements. As one of the first to challenge the racial exclusions within the suffrage movement, Wells demonstrated that true justice required the inclusion of all people, regardless of race or gender. Her work not only advanced the cause of women's suffrage but also helped to redefine the relationship between race and gender in the fight for equality. In the years following her departure from Memphis and her move to Chicago, Ida B. Wells continued to expand her activism and influence, both within the black community and in the broader fight for racial justice. One of her most important contributions during this period was the founding of the Negro Fellowship League in 1900. The League was established as a response to the needs of black men and women who had moved to Chicago from the South in search of better opportunities. At the time, the city's growing African American population faced severe economic and social challenges, and Wells believed it was vital to provide support and resources to help them succeed in their new environment. Wells saw firsthand the struggles that black migrants faced as they moved from the oppressive conditions of the South to the relative freedoms of the North. While Chicago was a bustling, progressive city, it still had its own issues with segregation, discrimination, and economic hardship for black residents. Many of the migrants found themselves in poverty, with limited job opportunities and few means of accessing resources that could help them improve their circumstances. Wells recognized that black people needed more than just basic survival. They needed the tools and opportunities to succeed and thrive in a society that often sought to keep them marginalized. The Negro Fellowship League was a direct response to this need. Wells established the League to provide a support network for African American men and women, particularly those who'd been displaced by the economic challenges of the South. The League's mission was to provide its members with the necessary resources and connections to succeed in Chicago's competitive job market, and it aimed to do so through education, networking, and professional development. The League was not just a social organization. It was a community-building effort designed to help black people overcome the systemic barriers they faced in the workforce and in society. Wells understood that the path to true freedom and equality was not only about political rights and civil liberties, it was also about economic empowerment and the ability to support oneself and one's family. The Negro Fellowship League was an extension of Wells' broader vision for black liberation, one that went beyond the fight against lynching and segregation to include the economic and social upliftment of the African American community. Through the League, Wells was able to connect young black men and women with job opportunities, education and mentorship, while also advocating for their rights in the larger citywide political context. She worked to establish connections with businesses and government institutions that could provide employment and resources for black Chicagoans. The League also became a platform for Wells to continue her advocacy for racial justice, organizing meetings and lectures that discussed issues ranging from economic inequality to the need for black political representation. In addition to the League's focus on economic advancement, Wells also worked to make sure that black women had a place within the organization. She understood that black women faced unique challenges within both the black community and society at large. As an advocate for women's rights, she knew that the liberation of black women was integral to the broader fight for racial equality. The League became an important space for black women to network, support one another, and find opportunities for growth in a world that often marginalized them both as women and as people of color. The work of the Negro Fellowship League was not without its challenges. While it was successful in providing resources to many African Americans in Chicago, it also faced resistance from within the city's existing political and social structures. Wells continued to challenge the status quo, calling for more inclusive policies that would benefit the entire black community. In this sense, the League was more than just a support group. It was an extension of Wells' ongoing fight for racial and gender equality. She believed that the economic advancement of black people was inextricably linked to their ability to participate fully in society, and the League became a way for her to empower individuals to make a lasting impact on their communities. Though the League itself was short-lived, its creation marked an important moment in Wells' ongoing activism. It demonstrated her understanding of the intersectionality of race, class, and gender, and her recognition that social change had to address all aspects of life, not just the most visible forms of oppression. Wells' ability to establish an organization that combined education, economic support, and social activism reflected her nuanced approach to fighting for racial justice. The Negro Fellowship League, while not a permanent institution, served as a model for future community organizations in Chicago and across the nation. It highlighted the importance of economic self-sufficiency as a means of empowerment for black people, especially as they navigated the complex and often hostile environment of a rapidly industrializing urban landscape. Wells' efforts to create an inclusive organization for both black men and women were crucial in expanding the scope of civil rights activism to include economic justice. This phase of Wells' life was also marked by personal growth. As she continued her work with the Negro Fellowship League, she deepened her understanding of the broader issues facing African Americans. She began to recognize the importance of coalition building and working with other organizations to create systemic change. The League, though it did not endure in the long term, helped Wells gain valuable experience in organizing and advocacy that would serve her well throughout the rest of her career. By the turn of the century, Wells had become a respected leader in both the African American and women's rights movements. The Negro Fellowship League was just one of the many ways she contributed to the advancement of black people in Chicago, and it solidified her place as a key figure in the broader struggle for racial and gender equality. Though her work was never easy and often met with resistance, Wells' commitment to social justice remained unwavering. In the years following her relocation to Chicago, Ida B., Wells continued to wield her pen as a powerful weapon for social justice. Although she had faced significant personal setbacks, including the destruction of the free speech in Memphis and the challenges of balancing family life with activism, Wells' commitment to the fight for racial equality remained unwavering. Her experiences in Chicago offered new opportunities to expand her influence, and she quickly became a leading figure in both the African American community and the broader social justice movement. By now, Wells had gained national recognition for her anti-lynching work, but her press work would take on even greater significance as she continued to advocate for the rights of African Americans. One of her primary goals was to educate the American public about the widespread nature of racial violence, particularly lynching, and to call for systemic change in the face of racial terrorism. Her articles and pamphlets continued to focus on the harsh realities that black people faced, and she used her writing to expose the lies, the myths, and the justifications that allowed lynching to persist. Though she had already made a name for herself with works like Southern Horrors lynch law in all its phases and a red record, Wells remained committed to educating the public and pushing for reform. She understood that, in order to bring about change, it was essential to keep the conversation about racial violence alive. She continued to publish articles, essays, and pamphlets that laid bare the truth about lynching, the complicity of local governments, and the lack of accountability for those responsible for racial violence. She became an authoritative voice in the growing national conversation about race relations, and her writings helped frame lynching as a critical issue that demanded immediate attention from both the public and lawmakers. One of Wells' most significant contributions during this period was her role in continuing the fight for anti-lynching legislation. Her reporting on lynching in the South, combined with her advocacy for federal laws that would make lynching a federal crime, made her a leading voice in the broader movement for racial justice. Though no such laws were passed during her lifetime, Wells' persistence laid the groundwork for future efforts to secure federal protections for Black Americans. Her unwavering commitment to justice, even in the face of immense obstacles, inspired countless others to join the fight for a more just society. Her work also focused on addressing the broader context of racial violence and discrimination. Wells was keenly aware that lynching was not an isolated problem. Rather, it was part of a larger system of oppression that included disenfranchisement, segregation, and economic inequality. She often wrote about the ways in which the legal system and political structures were complicit in perpetuating racial violence. Wells believed that the struggle for justice required not only the exposure of racial violence, but also a systemic transformation of American institutions. She called for comprehensive civil rights reforms, including the extension of voting rights to Black Americans, the dismantling of Jim Crow laws, and the creation of stronger protections against racial violence. While Wells continued to advocate for change through her writing, she also worked as an organizer, traveling widely to meet with other activists and civil rights organizations. In addition to her work with the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, and the Negro Fellowship League, she was involved in the creation of several key civil rights organizations, including the NAACP. Wells' ability to build coalitions and work alongside other leaders in the fight for racial justice was crucial in spreading her message and gathering support for legislative action. In her role as an educator and speaker, Wells used her platform to promote racial pride and empowerment. She was committed to the idea that African Americans should not only fight for justice, but also embrace their cultural heritage and stand proud of their achievements. She encouraged Black men and women to pursue education, take leadership roles in their communities, and demand equality on all fronts. Wells firmly believed that progress would only come when Black Americans were empowered to assert their rights and challenge the forces of oppression. Despite her immense contributions to the struggle for racial justice, Wells faced significant opposition from both white supremacy and the Black community. Her work was often met with hostility from white supremacist groups who sought to silence her. They viewed her outspoken advocacy for Black rights and her unapologetic stance against lynching as a direct threat to the status quo. Meanwhile, some members of the Black community, particularly those who believed in a more conciliatory approach to racial issues, felt that Wells' confrontational style was too radical. They feared that her uncompromising approach to exposing racial violence would only lead to further hostility and violence against Black people. Nonetheless, Wells' press work continued to grow in influence, and her voice became even more vital to the national conversation about race and justice. She was unyielding in her belief that the truth had to be told no matter the consequences. She continued to challenge the structures of racism, often at great personal risk, and her writing was instrumental in pushing the conversation about racial violence into the public consciousness. Her efforts helped lay the foundation for future civil rights movements, and her legacy as a journalist, educator, and activist remains a critical part of American history. As a journalist, Wells had no equal in her commitment to exposing the brutal reality of lynching and the larger system of racial violence. Her press work went beyond mere reporting. It was an act of resistance. In a time when racial violence was pervasive and often ignored, Wells used her pen to shed light on the truth and demand accountability. Her refusal to remain silent, even in the face of danger, made her one of the most important figures in the fight for racial justice in America. Wells' continued work as a journalist and activist, even as she faced personal challenges and public backlash, demonstrated the depth of her commitment to her cause. She recognized that the fight for racial equality was ongoing and multifaceted, and requiring not just the exposure of violence but also a long-term strategy for systemic change. Her ability to keep pressing forward, even when confronted with personal setbacks, made her one of the most influential figures in the early civil rights movement. By the time the Chicago race riots of 1919 erupted, Ida B. Wells had long been an influential voice in the struggle for racial justice. The violence that shook the city that summer, fueled by racial tension and economic hardship, served as a tragic reminder of the systemic racism that continued to plague American society. Wells, ever the fighter, responded to the violence with both indignation and determination. The riots themselves would further solidify her place as one of the most important figures in the ongoing battle for racial equality. The Chicago race riots began in late July 1919, following the tragic death of a young black man, Eugene Williams, who was stoned to death by a group of white youths. The incident occurred when Williams, while swimming in Lake Michigan, inadvertently crossed an invisible racial boundary between the black and white sections of the beach. White beachgoers began throwing stones at him, and the violence quickly escalated. This incident sparked a wave of violence across the city, with black and white mobs clashing in the streets, resulting in 38 deaths, 23 of whom were black, and hundreds more injured. The riots were a stark reminder of the volatile racial dynamics in the city, and they brought the issue of racial violence to the forefront of national discussion. Wells, now in her 50s and living in Chicago, was deeply disturbed by the riots. She saw them not just as an isolated incident of racial violence, but as part of a larger pattern of racial tensions that had been simmering for years. Chicago, like many other northern cities, had seen a significant migration of black people from the South, as they sought better economic opportunities and freedom from the oppressive Jim Crow laws. The so-called Great Migration had created a demographic shift in cities like Chicago, where black communities were increasingly asserting their presence and demanding equality. However, this migration had also led to competition for jobs, housing, and social resources between black and white residents. The black community, still struggling with poverty and discrimination, was often forced into overcrowded neighborhoods, while many white residents feared the changing racial makeup of their communities. These tensions, exacerbated by economic inequality, set the stage for the violence that would erupt in the summer of 1919. As a longtime advocate for the rights of African Americans, Wells knew that the riots could not be understood simply as an outburst of violence. They were the result of years of systemic inequality, racial hatred, and economic competition. She recognized that in order to truly address the root causes of the riots, the country would need to confront the deep-seated racism that had been perpetuated for generations. Wells, ever the scholar and activist, saw the riots as an opportunity to further the cause of racial justice by using the violence as a platform to demand both reform and accountability. In the aftermath of the riots, Wells wrote extensively about the violence that had swept through the city. Her analysis of the events focused not only on the immediate causes of the riots, but also on the larger patterns of racial segregation, economic inequality, and police brutality that allowed such violence to occur. She condemned both the white mob violence and the failure of city officials to intervene, pointing out the disparity in the way the police treated black and white residents. The black community, she argued, had been left to fend for itself in a society that consistently denied them justice. Wells' writings on the Chicago race riots were poignant and forceful, but they also reflected the frustration that had built up over years of activism. She felt that the violence in Chicago was a reflection of a larger societal failure, was one in which black people were denied both the protection of the law and the basic human dignity that every citizen should expect. Her critique was aimed not only at the perpetrators of the violence, but also at the systemic issues that allowed racial hatred and inequality to persist. As in her previous work on lynching, Wells continued to demand that the American government take responsibility for addressing racial injustice. She called for increased protections for black communities and the enforcement of anti-lynching laws. She also emphasized the need for greater political representation for black Americans, arguing that only through political power could African Americans begin to dismantle the systems of oppression that kept them marginalized. The Chicago race riots of 1919 marked a critical point in Wells's long career of activism. While the riots were an extreme and tragic example of the racial tensions that plagued American society, they also offered Wells an opportunity to sharpen her critique of the nation's racial policies. For Wells, the riots were a reflection of the failure of the government to adequately address racial violence, but they were also an opportunity to call for systemic change. Her efforts to address the issues raised by the Chicago race riots were part of a broader pattern of activism that had defined her career. Whether confronting lynching, segregation, or police violence, Wells remained committed to fighting for racial justice at all levels of society. Her work was not just about exposing injustice, but about demanding tangible change. Even as she faced the personal challenges of being an outspoken black woman in a racially hostile society, Wells continued to push for the kind of world where black Americans could live free of violence, fear, and oppression. The riots also deepened Wells' understanding of the intersection of race and class. The violence of 1919, she argued, was not just about racial animus. It was also about the economic disparities that were growing between black and white communities. The competition for jobs, housing, and social resources had created an atmosphere of resentment and fear, and it was this fear that led to the eruption of violence. For Wells, addressing racial inequality also meant addressing economic injustice, and she continued to argue for policies that would address both the social and economic factors that contributed to the violence in Chicago and beyond. As Ida B. Wells continued her relentless pursuit of justice for African Americans, her personal life was marked by a delicate balancing act between her family and her activism. Wells had long been committed to the cause of racial equality, but she was also a wife and a mother, a role that added layers of complexity to her already demanding life. The intersection of her personal and professional worlds became increasingly difficult to navigate as she balanced her responsibilities as a family member with the weight of her national and international activism. In 1895, Wells married Ferdinand Barnett, a prominent African-American attorney and editor of The Conservative, a newspaper based in Chicago. Barnett was supportive of Wells' work and shared her commitment to the advancement of black people, but their marriage would not be without its challenges. The couple had 4 children together, and Wells, despite her public persona as a powerful voice for social justice, was deeply devoted to raising her children. She sought to create a stable and loving home environment for them, one that would encourage their intellectual development and sense of pride in their heritage. However, the demands of motherhood and family life often clashed with Wells' activism. While Wells believed deeply in the importance of her work for the black community, she also understood that the values of education, respect, and family unity were central to her role as a mother. Balancing her commitment to the cause with her responsibilities at home often left her feeling torn between two worlds, one where she could challenge the most entrenched systems of injustice, and the other where she was dedicated to the nurturing and growth of her children. Wells' work as an activist required extensive travel, both within the United States and abroad. She spent time in Europe advocating for the cause of anti-lynching, and she often travelled to different cities to deliver lectures and organise rallies. These long trips, while crucial for advancing her cause, meant that she spent extended periods away from her family. Ferdinand Barnett, while understanding of his wife's commitment to her activism, was occasionally frustrated by the strain that her public life placed on their private one. Wells, on the other hand, was often conflicted between the need to be present for her children and her duty to continue the fight for racial justice. Despite these tensions, Wells and Barnett shared a strong partnership, and he was a steadfast ally in her work. He even helped her to publish some of her writings and was instrumental in supporting her campaigns against lynching. Barnett, who had been a successful lawyer, also contributed to the black community in Chicago by working to advance the legal rights of African Americans. His support allowed Wells to continue her advocacy with a degree of stability that would not have been possible without him. Wells' motherhood also influenced her activism in profound ways. As a mother, she was deeply aware of the vulnerabilities that black children faced in an oppressive society. Her concerns for her own children led her to advocate for the protection of all black children, particularly in terms of their safety from racial violence. Then, her writings and speeches often highlighted the need for black communities to protect their children from the threat of lynching and other forms of racial violence. Wells was determined to ensure that her children would grow up in a world that was safer and more just than the one she had known, though she knew the path to such a world would not be easy. Her children were not just her motivation, but also a source of strength. Wells raised her children to be proud of their heritage and to understand the importance of standing up for what was right. She was an active figure in their lives, teaching them about the value of education, the importance of family, and the necessity of activism. Her commitment to her children never waned, and she did her best to ensure that they understood the purpose behind her work. However, even as Wells faced the challenges of balancing her professional life with her responsibilities at home, her work often took a toll on her health. The emotional and physical strain of fighting against systemic oppression, coupled with the demands of motherhood, contributed to periods of exhaustion and stress. Wells was driven by a deep sense of duty to the cause, but she also knew that she needed to care for herself in order to continue her work. Throughout her life, Wells faced the inherent contradictions of being both a mother and a public figure. The societal expectations of women during her time were at odds with her role as an activist, and Wells often had to push back against these limitations. She knew that, as a woman and a mother, she would not be afforded the same opportunity as men, and she was determined to overcome these barriers in order to make a lasting impact. Wells' refusal to be confined by the traditional roles of women in her society made her one of the most radical and influential voices of her time. While her family life was not without its challenges, Wells' legacy as a mother and a fierce advocate for social justice continues to resonate. Her ability to maintain a loving home while also pursuing an unrelenting career in activism demonstrated her resilience and her commitment to both her family and the cause of racial equality. Through her example, she showed that the struggle for justice could be pursued on multiple fronts, with unwavering dedication to both the personal and the political. Wells' family life, its ups and downs, its joys and sacrifices, was a reflection of the larger struggle for racial equality that defined her career. Her children grew up in a home filled with activism, education, and love. They were raised to understand the importance of standing up for one's rights, to be proud of their heritage, and to continue the work their mother had begun. In this way, Wells' legacy lived on through the generations, not just in her activism, but in the values she instilled in her children, and the world she helped to shape. By the turn of the 20th century, Ida B. Wells had become an internationally recognized voice in the fight for racial justice, but her commitment to the cause only deepened with time. The expansion of her influence, particularly after her move to Chicago, allowed her to engage with a broader network of activists and organizations, which helped solidify her role as one of the leading figures in the civil rights movement. Wells' tireless work to expose the horrors of lynching, to advocate for black women's rights, and to challenge systemic racism would serve as the foundation for the next phase of her activism, one that was more focused than ever on achieving systemic change. Wells' career had always been driven by the urgency of racial injustice, but by the early 1900s, she had seen firsthand the limitations of reformist approaches. She had dedicated much of her life to fighting lynching through public speaking, writing, and organizing, but the violence, discrimination, and disenfranchisement faced by African Americans persisted at an alarming rate. She began to shift her focus toward more systemic efforts to dismantle the structures of racial oppression, with a particular emphasis on the need for comprehensive civil rights legislation. Her evolving views on civil rights were shaped by her continued frustration with the lack of progress in the legal and political systems. The passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had theoretically granted black Americans the right to freedom, citizenship, and voting, but the reality of life for most African Americans in the South was one of brutal oppression. Wells recognized that the root causes of lynching and racial violence were deeply tied to the broader system of segregation, disenfranchisement, and white supremacy, and that these structures had to be fundamentally addressed if true equality was ever to be achieved. In the face of these systemic barriers, Wells became a leading advocate for federal civil rights legislation. She was an early proponent of the idea that the federal government must take responsibility for ensuring the rights of black citizens and for holding violators of those rights accountable. She recognized that local and state governments, especially in the South, were often complicit in racial violence, and she called on the federal government to step in and protect black Americans from the violence they faced on a daily basis. While Wells' efforts to secure federal anti-lynching laws were ultimately unsuccessful during her lifetime, her advocacy laid the groundwork for the later civil rights victories of the 20th century. Her calls for stronger legal protections, for the enforcement of civil rights laws, and for the recognition of black Americans as full citizens of the United States would echo throughout the years, for influencing the civil rights movement and figures like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and other prominent leaders. Her commitment to civil rights also led her to become more involved in national organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which was founded in 1909. While Wells did not join the NAACP, she supported its mission and worked closely with its leaders, particularly W.E.B. Du Bois, who shared her vision for the advancement of black Americans. The NAACP, like Wells, recognized the importance of legal action, political engagement, and public education in the fight for civil rights, and it would go on to become one of the most influential organizations in the history of the American civil rights movement. Despite her growing prominence, Wells' activism was not without controversy. Her outspoken criticisms of both white supremacy and the complacency of black leaders sometimes put her at odds with her allies. Many black leaders, including some within the NAACP, felt that Wells' confrontational style was too radical for the times, particularly her focus on lynching and the way it was being used to control and intimidate black communities. Wells, however, remained steadfast in her belief that true justice required direct action, and that the fight for civil rights could not be confined to incremental progress or half measures. She understood that the system of white supremacy was deeply entrenched, and that it would take bold action to disrupt it. In addition to her work with organisations like the NAACP, Wells continued to write for newspapers, speaking out about the need for a more just society. Her column in the Chicago Defender became one of her primary outlets for her thoughts on race, gender, and social justice. Wells used this platform to challenge both black and white Americans to confront the racial inequities that permeated every aspect of society. She was particularly focused on the ways that African Americans could work together to uplift their communities and demand better treatment. Wells believed that the civil rights movement had to be led by black people, and that they had the power to create meaningful change through solidarity, activism, and education. Her increasing involvement in national civil rights efforts did not come at the expense of her advocacy for women's rights. Wells' feminist views were central to her understanding of racial justice, and she continued to fight for the rights of black women throughout her career. She remained an advocate for women's suffrage, often using her platform to call attention to the fact that black women had been excluded from many of the mainstream suffrage movements. Wells recognised that black women's voices had been marginalised not only in the fight for civil rights, but also in the fight for women's rights. She worked tirelessly to ensure that they were given the platform and the recognition they deserved. Wells also continued to speak out against the economic exploitation of black people, particularly black women. She understood that the fight for civil rights had to include economic justice, as black Americans were often excluded from access to jobs, education, and economic opportunities. Wells was an early advocate for the economic empowerment of black people, and she recognized that true equality could not be achieved without addressing the economic disparities that existed between black and white Americans. By the time Wells reached her later years, she had cemented her place as one of the foremost civil rights leaders of her era. Her commitment to racial justice, her tireless efforts to expose the realities of lynching, and her advocacy for both women's rights and economic empowerment would leave a lasting legacy in the history of the civil rights movement. Though she did not live to see the full fruits of her labour, particularly the passage of significant anti-lynching laws and the eventual success of the civil rights movement, her work set the stage for the changes that would come in the 20th century. Her deepening commitment to civil rights was not just about fighting for laws and policies, it was about fighting for the dignity and humanity of African Americans. Wells understood that the struggle for equality required a broad, multifaceted approach that included not just legal protections but social, economic, and political empowerment. Her activism, spanning many decades, remained rooted in her belief that black people had the right to live freely, with dignity, and without the constant threat of violence. As Ida B. Wells entered the later years of her life, her health began to decline, but her dedication to the cause of racial justice remained as strong as ever. Wells had spent decades advocating for the rights of black Americans, exposing the horrors of lynching and calling for civil rights reform. Yet, as the physical toll of her work accumulated, she was forced to reckon with the reality that she could not continue her activism at the same pace. In her mid-50s, Wells began to experience physical exhaustion. The stress of constant travel, the emotional weight of her work, and the health challenges that often come with aging all took their toll on her body. Wells had always been a fierce fighter. Her resilience had been evident in her work against lynching, in her tireless efforts to advocate for women's suffrage, and in her ability to challenge both white supremacy and racial indifference in the black community. Yet, as she grew older, she found that she needed to slow down. Despite her declining health, Wells remained committed to her mission. In many ways, her later years were defined by a deepened sense of reflection. Wells was able to look back on her incredible achievements in the struggle for racial and gender justice. But she was also acutely aware that much work remained. While the passage of time had brought some changes, there was growing awareness of racial injustice and greater advocacy for civil rights. Wells knew that the battle was far from over. One of the more poignant aspects of Wells' later life was her reflection on her role in the broader civil rights movement. By this time, she had seen the emergence of new leaders, new movements, and new efforts to challenge racial segregation and inequality. She had seen the rise of organizations like the NAACP, whose founding was partly inspired by her tireless work on behalf of Black Americans. She had watched as her own advocacy and writing had contributed to the national and international conversation about race and injustice. Yet, even as Wells acknowledged the progress that had been made, she was also keenly aware of how far the nation still had to go. She was not one to settle for half measures or incremental change. She had always believed that the fight for justice was not just about addressing the symptoms of racism, but about dismantling the structures that perpetuated inequality. Wells knew that, while strides had been made, racial violence, economic disenfranchisement, and political disenfranchisement remained entrenched in the fabric of American society. Throughout her later years, Wells remained active in the fight for civil rights, though her health limited her ability to engage in the day-to-day work of activism. She continued to write and speak when she could, offering her reflections on the state of the nation and the need for ongoing change. Wells never stopped advocating for justice, but she also recognized that her role in the movement was evolving. Her contributions would be remembered for years to come, but the new generation of activists, many of whom had been inspired by her work, would continue the fight she had begun. In the face of illness, Wells reflected not only on the work that still needed to be done, but also on her own personal journey. She had spent decades fighting against systems of oppression, but she was also deeply grateful for the opportunities she had had to lead, to educate, and to create lasting change. The cause of justice had been her life's work, and she knew that the generations that followed her would carry the torch forward. Wells' health challenges in her later years were not just physical, they were also emotional. She had borne witness to so much injustice and had faced significant personal and professional challenges throughout her life. The emotional weight of those battles was considerable, and she knew that the emotional resilience required to sustain such long-term activism was as demanding as the physical strain. Yet Wells's sense of purpose never wavered. Even as she faced her own mortality, she remained deeply committed to the idea that racial justice was possible, even if it took generations to achieve. As she approached the end of her life, Wells found solace in the impact she had made. She could see the legacy she had created, not just through her work in journalism and activism, but also through the lives of the countless individuals she had inspired. She had sparked a movement, and that movement had grown, expanding into new generations of leaders and activists. Wells' contributions to the struggle for civil rights and gender equality were secure in the annals of history, and her story would continue to inspire those who carried on the work she'd started. Wells passed away on March 25, 1931, at the age of 68. Her death marked the end of an era, but her legacy lived on. In the years following her death, her influence only continued to grow, and she became recognized as one of the most significant figures in the fight for racial and gender justice in the United States. She was celebrated for her courage, her tireless work, and her unyielding commitment to truth and justice. In the end, Wells' health may have declined, but her spirit and her impact did not. Her work laid the groundwork for the civil rights movements that would follow, and her name became synonymous with the struggle for racial and gender equality. She was and remains a symbol of resistance and resilience, of a life devoted to the fight for justice and the dignity of Black Americans and women. Her legacy is not only one of advocacy, but of profound personal strength, courage, and determination. Ida B. Wells' death in 1931 marked the end of an era, but her impact on the civil rights movement and the struggle for racial justice continued to resonate long after her passing. Her legacy as one of the most courageous and influential activists in American history is undeniable. Throughout her life, Wells fought tirelessly to expose racial violence, dismantle segregation, and secure the rights of African Americans, particularly black women. Her work laid the foundation for future generations of activists, and her influence can be seen in the movements that followed. In the years following her death, Wells' contributions to the fight for civil rights gained increasing recognition. Her pioneering efforts in the anti-lynching movement, her advocacy for women's suffrage, and her broader commitment to racial and gender equality were finally receiving the attention they deserved. She had been a voice crying in the wilderness during her lifetime, often ignored or dismissed. But her posthumous recognition began to grow, cementing her place as a central figure in American history. One of the most important aspects of Wells' legacy is her role in the anti-lynching movement. Her work as a journalist and investigator, gathering first-hand accounts of lynching, exposing the lies that underpin the justifications for these brutal killings, and calling for systemic change, was groundbreaking. Wells was one of the first to challenge the pervasive myth that lynching was a response to criminal behavior or the supposed threat posed by black men to white women. She revealed the economic and political motives behind lynching, showing that it was often used to terrorize black communities and maintain white supremacy. Through her pamphlets, speeches, and articles, Wells made lynching a national issue, drawing widespread attention to the horrors of racial violence. She was unrelenting in her demand for federal anti-lynching legislation, and while such laws were not passed during her lifetime, her advocacy paved the way for future civil rights efforts. The 1950s and 1960s saw a resurgence in the fight for racial justice, and Wells' early efforts were honored by the new generation of activists who saw her as a trailblazer. Wells' legacy also lies in her work as a feminist and advocate for black women's rights. She was an early and outspoken voice for women's suffrage, challenging the white-dominated suffrage movement to include black women and address the specific issues they faced. In an era when women's rights were often framed as a white middle-class issue, Wells brought attention to the ways that racism and sexism intersected to oppress black women. She insisted that the suffrage movement must be inclusive of black women's voices, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that their struggles were recognized. In addition to advocating for black women's right to vote, Wells was a fierce critic of the gendered aspects of racial oppression. She challenged the conventional thinking of her time, particularly the idea that black women were somehow less deserving of equal treatment than white women or black men. Wells was one of the first to highlight the intersectionality of race and gender, and her work in this regard laid the groundwork for future feminist movements. Her insistence on the equality of black women and their central role in the fight for racial justice was groundbreaking and remains a vital part of her legacy. Wells' influence can also be seen in the broader civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. Her work in the early years of the struggle for black rights set the stage for the major victories of the 1960s, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The civil rights movement leaders, including figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Malcolm X, were inspired by Wells' activism, and many of them cited her as a source of inspiration. King, in particular, recognized the importance of Wells' work and praised her for her role in exposing the brutality of lynching and in fighting for the rights of African Americans and women. Despite her significant contributions, Wells remained somewhat marginalized in the history of the civil rights movement for many years. Her focus on the issue of lynching and her refusal to compromise on the need for direct action sometimes put her at odds with other civil rights leaders, and she was often overshadowed by figures like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. However, in recent years, there has been a growing recognition of Wells' pivotal role in shaping the course of the civil rights movement. Scholars, activists, and organizations have worked to elevate her legacy and ensure that her contributions are fully acknowledged. In 2020, the United States Postal Service issued a stamp in honor of Wells, marking the centennial of the publication of Southern Horrors and recognizing her as a central figure in the struggle for racial justice. The stamp, which features a portrait of Wells, serves as a reminder of the profound impact she had on the nation and the world. It is part of a broader effort to ensure that Wells's story is not forgotten, and that future generations understand the important role she played in shaping the fight for civil rights. Wells' legacy extends beyond her work in the anti-lynching movement and her advocacy for black women's rights. Her contributions to journalism, her commitment to truth-telling, and her unwavering belief in the power of education and activism to bring about social change are all integral parts of her legacy. Wells demonstrated that one person, armed with a pen and a sense of justice, could spark a movement and change the course of history. Her work remains a powerful testament to the enduring fight for racial equality and human dignity. As a writer, Wells was unafraid to expose uncomfortable truths. As an activist, she was willing to risk everything to challenge the systems of power that perpetuated injustice. Her courage, vision, and relentless pursuit of justice paved the way for future generations of activists, and her legacy continues to inspire those who work for a world that is more just, more equitable, and more free. In the years following Ida B. Wells' death in 1931, her contributions to the civil rights movement and her advocacy for the rights of African Americans began to receive increasing recognition. Though she had been largely overlooked during her lifetime, particularly in comparison to other prominent civil rights leaders of her era, the 20th century would see a growing acknowledgement of Wells' pioneering work in the fight against lynching and her broader efforts to dismantle the systems of racial oppression. In the immediate aftermath of her death, Wells' work continued to inspire activists and scholars who were seeking to address the long-standing injustices faced by Black Americans. Her influence was particularly felt within the burgeoning civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and others who fought for desegregation, voting rights, and the end of racial violence were deeply influenced by Wells' uncompromising stance against injustice. Wells' calls for the federal government to intervene in cases of racial violence, her commitment to exposing the systemic nature of lynching, and her efforts to uplift black women laid the foundation for many of the civil rights reforms of the mid-20th century. However, despite her significant role in these movements, Wells was not always given the recognition she deserved. The historical narratives that emerged around the civil rights movement often overshadowed her legacy, focusing more on figures like Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and later Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. Wells' radical approach, her refusal to compromise on the fight against racial violence, even when it made her unpopular, was not always seen as compatible with the more moderate approaches of some of her contemporaries. She often found herself at odds with other black leaders who believed in a more gradual approach to reform, and this tension affected how her work was remembered in the years after her death. Nonetheless, Wells's legacy began to gain more attention in the latter half of the 20th century. As the civil rights movement gained momentum, historians, scholars, and activists began to re-examine the history of the fight for racial justice and to uncover the stories of the women and men whose contributions had been marginalized. Wells, once forgotten or sidelined in historical narratives, began to be celebrated for her bold leadership, her pioneering work in journalism, and her lifelong commitment to racial equality. In the 1960s and 1970s, scholars began to recognize the importance of Wells' work in exposing the atrocities of lynching and in challenging the narratives that had justified racial violence. The publication of several biographies about Wells, including Ida, A Sword Among Lions by Paula J. Giddings in 2008, helped to bring her story to a new generation of readers. Gidding's biography, in particular, played a key role in reshaping the public's understanding of Wells as a central figure in the civil rights struggle and feminist movements. It revealed the complexity of her life and activism, emphasizing her role not only as a journalist and anti-lynching crusader, but also as an early feminist who advocated for the rights of black women. In 1990, Wells was posthumously awarded the Spingarn Medal by the NAACP, an honour given to individuals who have made significant contributions to the advancement of African Americans. This recognition was a major step in restoring Wells to her rightful place in history, and it acknowledged her pivotal role in the fight against lynching and her lifelong commitment to civil rights. The Spingarn Medal was one of many honours that helped ensure Wells' place in the history of American social justice movements. In 1993, Wells was also posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the United States' highest civilian honours. The recognition was a testament to the enduring impact of her work, as well as the broader shifts in American society that had begun to acknowledge the contributions of women and African Americans in shaping the nation's history. The medal was awarded to Wells for her courage, vision, and tireless advocacy for racial justice, as well as for her groundbreaking work in journalism. One of the most enduring markers of Wells' posthumous recognition is the growing number of memorials and institutions named in her honour. In 1991, a statue of Wells was erected in Chicago's Bronzeville neighbourhood, where she had lived for much of her life. The statue stands as a tribute to her contributions to the city and to the broader struggle for civil rights. Wells' legacy is also honoured through the Ida B. Wells Barnett House, which was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1977. This historic home in Chicago was where Wells lived and worked for many years, and it serves as a reminder of her lifelong commitment to justice and equality. Wells' name has also become synonymous with the fight for women's rights, particularly the rights of black women. Her advocacy for black women's suffrage, her work in the women's rights movement, and her pioneering feminist views have influenced generations of women who continue to fight for gender equality and racial justice. In 2020, the US Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honouring Wells as part of a series celebrating American heroes. The stamp features her portrait and serves as a reminder of her tireless work in fighting for the dignity and rights of African Americans and women. As Wells' legacy continues to grow, her influence is felt in movements for social justice around the world. Her commitment to truth-telling, her unyielding fight for racial justice, and her insistence on the inclusion of black women in the fight for equality have inspired countless activists, educators, and journalists. Wells's story serves as both a blueprint for social change and a call to action for those who continue to fight for a more just, equitable world. Through the recognition of her work, Ida B. Wells has become a symbol of courage, resilience, and the power of the individual to change history. Her legacy continues to inspire movements for racial, gender, and economic justice, and her life is a reminder of the transformative power of activism. Wells' refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice, her relentless pursuit of the truth, and her unwavering commitment to equality are as relevant today as they were during her lifetime. Ida B. Wells' impact on the civil rights movement continues to resonate strongly in modern activism, especially in the fight for racial justice, gender equality, and the dismantling of systemic racism. While Wells was a pioneering figure in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, her work laid the foundation for the modern civil rights movements that would rise in the 20th century and continue to shape social justice efforts in the 21st century. One of the clearest ways that Wells's influence is seen today is in the ongoing battle against racial violence and lynching. Her relentless efforts to expose the brutal practice of lynching in the South and her determination to bring attention to the lack of accountability for those who committed such atrocities set the stage for the modern conversations about police violence and state-sanctioned murder. The Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in the 2000s in response to police violence against black men and women, echoes the demands that Wells made in her own time for justice. Accountability and the protection of black lives. Just as Wells fought to hold the state accountable for the deaths of black men and women at the hands of mobs, today's activists work to challenge the killing of black individuals by police and demand justice for those whose lives have been unjustly taken. The Black Lives Matter movement, in particular, shares a deep theological connection to Wells' activism. Wells believed that only through organised collective action and national attention could racial violence be confronted and ended. She understood that the fight for racial justice was not just about individual cases, but about confronting a larger system of violence, inequality, and dehumanization. Her work, like the Black Lives Matter movement, sought to challenge the idea that black lives were expendable, and it placed the responsibility for change on the shoulders of both the state and the public. Moreover, Wells' advocacy for black women's rights continues to inspire modern feminist movements, particularly those focused on intersectionality. The term intersectionality, coined by legal scholar Kimberlé Crenshaw in the late 1980s, refers to the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, which create overlapping systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Wells was one of the first to articulate this intersection, challenging both racial and gendered oppression in her work. Her insistence that black women's voices be central to both the women's suffrage and civil rights movements laid the groundwork for the intersectional feminism that thrives today. Yet Wells understood that black women faced unique challenges, simultaneously battling the racial violence that targeted black men and the gendered violence and discrimination that oppressed women. She worked to ensure that black women had a seat at the table in all of these conversations, fighting for their right to vote, their right to be heard, and their right to participate fully in both civil rights and feminist movements. This commitment to the intersection of race and gender is reflected in today's activism, which places a particular focus on the experiences of black women, trans women, and other marginalized groups within the broader fight for equality. Wells' work also has profound implications for today's work around social justice in the realm of education. Her focus on education as a tool for empowerment and social change continues to be central to modern civil rights movements. Wells herself was a product of education, and she used it as a tool to help her community confront racial injustice. She was a strong advocate for equal access to education for African Americans, especially in the face of institutional barriers that limited the opportunities available to black students. Wells' commitment to the education of black children as a means to challenge oppression continues to be reflected in modern efforts to address disparities in educational opportunities, particularly within the context of school desegregation and the fight for equal access to quality education for all students, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. Wells also set an example for the power of journalism in creating social change. Her career as a journalist, activist, and public speaker highlighted the importance of using the written and spoken word to inform the public, challenge entrenched injustices, and call for action. In today's world, journalism and media continue to play a crucial role in shaping public opinion and holding power accountable. Wells' pioneering work in exposing the violence of lynching and challenging the mainstream media's portrayal of black Americans provided a roadmap for journalists and activists alike. Her commitment to truth-telling, even in the face of opposition, remains a cornerstone of journalistic integrity in the fight for justice. Her work as an investigative journalist, particularly in the realm of lynching, as has been particularly influential in shaping modern reporting on racial violence. Wells' legacy can be seen in the contemporary work of investigative journalists who shine a light on the disproportionate use of force against black individuals, the failures of the justice system, and the systemic racism that persists in modern policing and law enforcement. Wells' refusal to accept the comfortable narratives presented by the powerful, whether in government, media, or law enforcement, has inspired generations of journalists to dig deeper, ask the tough questions, and tell the stories that need to be heard. In addition to her contributions to racial and gender justice, Wells' unwavering commitment to creating a more just society has made her a symbol of resistance and resilience. Her life is a testament to the power of one individual to challenge injustice, even in the face of great personal risk. Wells refused to be intimidated by the systems of oppression that sought to silence her, and her example continues to inspire those who fight for change. Her activism, whether through writing, public speaking, or organizing, reminds us of the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity and speaking truth to power, no matter the cost. Finally, Wells' contributions to social justice and activism remain a touchstone for those involved in the fight for racial justice today. Whether in the form of protests, legislative advocacy, or grassroots organizing, the spirit of Wells' work lives on. Her unwavering commitment to the idea that racial violence and inequality must be confronted and dismantled has inspired a broad coalition of activists across the globe. Whether it's the fight against police violence in the United States, the demand for reparations, or the global movement for racial justice, the legacy of Ida B. Wells is woven into the fabric of today's social justice efforts. Ida B. Wells' tireless efforts to expose racial injustice, particularly through her investigative work on lynching, helped to push the conversation around civil rights into the national and international spotlight. Today, her legacy continues to serve as a reminder of the importance of representation, not only in the fight for racial justice but also in the broader struggle for gender equality and civil rights. Wells was one of the first to advocate for a complete and nuanced understanding of how race and gender intersect in the oppression of marginalized groups. Her legacy continues to be a beacon for activists and movements fighting against inequality, oppression, and injustice. Wells was groundbreaking in her approach to confronting the systemic forces of racism. While much of the fight for racial equality in the late 19th and early 20th centuries focused primarily on the racial discrimination faced by black men, Wells placed equal emphasis on the unique and often overlooked struggles of black women. She argued that black women were often victims of both racial violence and gendered discrimination, which created an especially cruel form of marginalization. Her belief in the intersectionality of race and gender laid the groundwork for later generations of feminists and activists, most notably those in the second-wave feminist movement and contemporary intersectional feminism. In much the same way that Wells's writings and activism opened the eyes of the public to the horrors of lynching, her work in the women's suffrage movement also exposed the limitations and racial exclusions that plagued the fight for women's rights. Wells, as both an advocate for black rights and a fierce feminist, saw clearly that the suffrage movement, often thought of as an inclusive cause, had largely excluded black women, particularly those in the South. At the time, white suffragists like Susan B. and Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton focused on securing the vote for white women, but did not take into account the unique needs of black women, especially in the face of the disenfranchisement and violence they faced. Wells recognized that the suffrage movement was in part a fight for the broader human rights of women, but also understood that black women were specifically left out of the conversation. She criticized white suffragists for their unwillingness to include black women in their efforts, and she firmly believed that the cause of women's rights should not be separated from the fight for racial justice. Her activism in the suffrage movement was groundbreaking, as she continuously pushed for an inclusive agenda, one that saw the enfranchisement of black women as central to the success of the larger movement. Her commitment to representation in the suffrage movement was also mirrored in her work on anti-lynching. Wells understood that the failure to hold those responsible for lynching accountable perpetuated not just the physical violence, but also the systemic and cultural violence against black communities. Her belief in the importance of representation for marginalized groups extended beyond the suffrage movement and lynching, reaching all aspects of the fight for civil rights. Today, Wells' legacy remains integral to ongoing social justice movements, particularly the fight for racial and gender equality. The issues she fought for, including the rights of black women, economic empowerment for African Americans, and the pursuit of civil liberties for all, are still at the forefront of modern activism. And Wells' insistence that black people had the right to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of gender or race, laid the groundwork for the modern intersectional approach to activism, one that recognizes the many layers of discrimination and oppression that affect marginalized people. Wells' commitment to truth-telling in her journalism has also been a major part of her enduring legacy. The power of the written word in exposing injustice cannot be overstated, and Wells understood the importance of using her platform to bring attention to the systemic forces that perpetuated violence, inequality, and exploitation. Her investigative work in Southern Horrors and A Red Record showcased the depths of the racial violence and terror that black communities faced, especially in the South. Through her writing, she was able to challenge the dominant narratives about lynching, race relations, and black life in America, and her courage in doing so made her one of the most prominent figures of her time. Her journalism also speaks to the ongoing importance of accurate and fair reporting in today's fight for racial justice. In an era of misinformation and widespread attempts to obscure the truth, Wells' work serves as a reminder that the fight for justice depends on those who are willing to document and expose the truth, no matter the cost. Her writings, often painstakingly researched and carefully considered, are a testament to the importance of integrity in journalism, and her work continues to inspire journalists and activists who are fighting against systemic racism and inequality today. Representation, both in media and in political structures, is essential to achieving true equality, and Wells was one of the first to understand that. Her insistence on the inclusion of black women in the fight for civil rights, suffrage, and anti-lynching legislation demonstrated her belief that a complete fight for justice required all voices to be heard. Her activism and commitment to equality remind us that the fight for freedom and justice is not a fight for a single group, but for the recognition and upliftment of all people who are oppressed. In the years since Wells's death, her legacy has been carried forward by a new generation of activists, scholars, and journalists who continue to advocate for the issues she championed. Her work on anti-lynching, women's suffrage, and the fight for black dignity remains relevant today, as racial violence, police brutality, and gender inequality continue to affect communities of colour. The rise of movements like Black Lives Matter, the ongoing struggle for women's rights, and the broader movement for social justice all owe much to the work and spirit of Ida B. Wells. Wells' insistence on intersectionality, the idea that race and gender cannot be separated in the fight for justice, has been particularly influential in shaping modern activism. Today's leaders in the fight for racial and gender equality continue to be inspired by Wells' uncompromising stance, and her legacy remains a powerful force in the ongoing struggle for a more just and equitable world. As the civil rights movement evolved throughout the 20th century, Ida B. Wells' contributions became more widely recognized, particularly her legacy in the fields of journalism, social justice, and education. Wells' commitment to educating the next generation, whether through her advocacy, her written work, or the organization she helped found, remains one of the most enduring aspects of her legacy. She believed that education was the key to personal and societal transformation, and she used it as a tool for social change throughout her life. Wells' own educational journey had been marked by resilience and an unrelenting pursuit of knowledge. After the death of her parents, she was forced to take on the responsibility of caring for her younger siblings, which led her to leave school at a young age. Despite this, she continued to educate herself, devouring books and articles, keeping up with the latest political developments, and eventually earning the respect of both black and white intellectuals and activists. Her self-driven education, combined with her early training as a teacher, gave her the confidence to challenge the systemic oppression she witnessed throughout her life. Wells understood the power of education, both for the individual and for society at large. She recognized that an educated community could not be easily oppressed, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that African Americans, particularly black women, had access to educational opportunities. While her primary focus was on ending lynching and racial violence, Wells saw the fight for education as inextricably linked to the struggle for civil rights. Her work as an educator and her belief in the transformative power of learning played a central role in shaping the trajectory of black empowerment and intellectual development. Her role in shaping education for African Americans extended beyond her own writing and journalism. Wells was deeply involved in various educational efforts, including her advocacy for black children's education. Throughout her career, she continually fought against the marginalization of black students in the South, advocating for more equitable access to quality schooling. Her work exposed how black children, particularly in the South, were being denied basic educational resources, and she tirelessly pushed for reforms that would provide black children with the same opportunities as their white counterparts. Wells believed that an educated black community was essential to achieving racial equality and justice, and she fought for the right of black children to attend schools that were free of segregation and violence. And in addition to her advocacy for black children's education, Wells also took part in efforts to establish and support institutions that would provide higher education for African Americans. She worked closely with organizations like the Tuskegee Institute and was a supporter of the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, which worked to improve the lives of black women through social programs and education. Wells understood that economic, political, and educational empowerment for black people required institutional support, and she believed that schools and universities could be powerful agents of change. Her writings and speeches frequently addressed the importance of education, especially for women. Wells recognized the critical role that women, particularly black women, could play in advancing the cause of civil rights. But she also understood that women's voices were often excluded from the larger conversation. She was committed to ensuring that black women had access to the same educational opportunities as their male counterparts and white women. Wells' insistence on the inclusion of black women in the fight for civil rights was not only about gender equality, it was also about ensuring that black women could use education to improve their economic and social standing. Wells believed that an educated woman, especially a black woman, was a formidable force for change in any society. In her later years, Wells reflected on the importance of education as a means of securing justice for future generations. She became increasingly focused on the need to create more opportunities for African Americans to enter fields of work that had traditionally been closed off to them, such as law, medicine, and journalism. She recognized that to achieve true equality, it was essential for black people to occupy positions of power and influence within all aspects of society. This belief in the importance of education for social and political empowerment made Wells a staunch advocate for scholarship and intellectual growth in her community. The legacy of Wells as an advocate for education lives on in the many institutions and programs that continue her work. The Ida B. Wells Scholarship Fund, for example, provides educational opportunities for young women pursuing degrees in journalism and social justice. This scholarship, which was established to honour Wells' commitment to education, serves as a reminder of the lasting impact that Wells had on the lives of countless students who continue to work for racial equality and justice. Wells also remains an important figure in contemporary academic scholarship, with numerous studies and books written about her life and work. Her contributions to both the fields of journalism and social justice continue to be studied by scholars in disciplines ranging from history to gender studies to political science. As an early example of a black woman who was both a journalist and an activist, Wells' work is examined in academic circles for its groundbreaking approach to activism, particularly for the way she combined investigative journalism with social advocacy. Today, Wells' name is associated with many of the institutions and movements that continue to fight for civil rights and justice. Her work in the field of education, both formal and informal, remains a critical part of the legacy she left behind. Whether it is through the scholarship that bears her name, the books that continue to inspire new generations of students, or the work of countless activists who draw inspiration from her tireless efforts, Wells' commitment to education has had a profound and lasting impact. In addition to her work on behalf of black children and women, Wells' influence in the field of education also extends to the larger civil rights struggle. Wells was one of the earliest leaders to recognize that the path to full equality and social justice for African Americans required more than just legal reform. It required a fundamental shift in how black people were educated, how their histories were taught, and how they were represented in American society. Her advocacy for equal access to education and her commitment to the intellectual development of black people remain as relevant today as they were during her lifetime. Ida B. Wells' activism transcended the fight for racial justice alone. She was a pioneering figure in recognizing the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the pursuit of equality. This understanding of how various systems of oppression, racism, sexism, and classism interact to affect marginalized communities remains one of her most enduring contributions to the civil rights and feminist movements. Long before the term intersectionality was coined by Kimberlé Crenshaw in the late 20th century, Wells intuitively understood and expressed the interconnectedness of oppression, especially as it related to the experiences of black women. Wells' experiences as a black woman shaped her advocacy. She often spoke out about the unique challenges faced by African American women, those who were at the crossroads of racism and sexism. She understood that black women's oppression was not just about their race or their gender alone, but about how the two worked in tandem to perpetuate their marginalization in society. Wells was one of the first to call attention to how black women faced violence and discrimination, both in the public sphere and in their private lives, making their struggles distinct from those of both white women and black men. Her work in the anti-lynching movement, for instance, was informed by this intersectional lens. Wells highlighted how the practice of lynching was not only a tool of racial control, but also a means of reinforcing gendered stereotypes about black men and women. The common justification for lynching, especially in the South, was that it was a form of protection for white women from alleged black male violence. This myth, that black men were inherently dangerous to white women, was used to justify brutal violence, yet Wells pushed back against this narrative. She exposed how many lynching victims were men accused of trivial or fabricated crimes, but she also connected the widespread violence to the way in which black women were both hypersexualized and disempowered in the public imagination. Wells' recognition of this dual oppression made her an early advocate for both racial and gender justice. She was not content with simply challenging racial violence in isolation. She fought for black women's inclusion in the larger suffrage movement and beyond. Her activism in the early suffrage movement, which was often dominated by white women's concerns, focused on the exclusion of black women from the right to vote and their consistent erasure from feminist agendas. Wells demanded that the fight for women's rights must be inclusive of African American women and that their unique struggles be recognized and addressed within the broader movement for women's equality. Her intersectional analysis was also reflected in her critiques of both black and white leadership. While Wells was deeply involved in the black community, she was never afraid to challenge prominent figures within that community if she believed they were not fully inclusive or were perpetuating systemic inequalities. She frequently criticized black male leaders like Booker T. Washington for their reluctance to address the specific needs of black women. Wells believed that the civil rights movement should fight for the rights of all black people, and this meant ensuring that black women's voices were heard and their unique struggles acknowledged. Wells' activism also extended to her critique of the mainstream feminist movement, particularly the suffragists who were unwilling to acknowledge the specific needs of black women. In the early 20th century, many white suffragists were hesitant to push for the inclusion of black women in the suffrage movement, fearing that it would jeopardize their relationships with white voters, particularly in the South. Wells, however, understood that black women were integral to the fight for equality, and that their exclusion was not only a betrayal of feminist ideals, but also a reinforcement of racial discrimination. She called for an inclusive feminist movement that was rooted in racial justice, while advocating for black women's rights to vote and to be recognized as full and equal citizens. This intersectional approach made Wells a radical figure in her time, as she pushed back against both white supremacy and the patriarchal structures within her own community. She was uncompromising in her demands for justice, and her activism was always centered on the most marginalized people. Her recognition of how race, gender, and class intersect to perpetuate oppression helped to shape the direction of future feminist and civil rights movements. It was her insistence on the inclusion of black women, both within the suffrage movement and in the fight for civil rights, that made her such a pivotal figure in early 20th century activism. In the modern era, the term intersectionality has become a cornerstone of feminist and civil rights theory, particularly within the context of social justice movements that focus on the overlapping systems of oppression that affect people differently based on their race, gender, class, sexual orientation, and other social identities. While Wells never used the term herself, her activism anticipated the ideas behind intersectional feminism. The concept of intersectionality, as it exists today, builds upon Wells' approach to understanding the multifaceted nature of oppression and how those who occupy multiple marginalized identities experience compounded forms of discrimination. Wells' work continues to resonate within the contemporary feminist and civil rights movements, especially as activists today confront the persistent issues of racial violence, police brutality, and economic inequality. Her advocacy for the rights of black women, her critique of both white supremacy and patriarchal structures, and her unwavering commitment to justice are ideals that are still at the heart of modern struggles for social justice. Through her example, Wells taught that true liberation for any group cannot be achieved without considering the intersecting systems of oppression that affect individuals in different ways. Whether it's the fight for economic justice, the call for an end to police violence, or the struggle for reproductive rights, the lessons of intersectionality that Wells championed continue to inform and guide activists and movements striving for a more just and equitable society. By the 1920s, Ida B. Wells had already made a profound impact on the course of American history. Her years of fighting racial violence, advocating for black women's rights, and challenging the systems of oppression that pervaded American society had solidified her as one of the most formidable activists of her time. Yet, as Wells entered the final chapter of her life, she found herself reflecting on both the progress that had been made and the work that was still to be done. The 1920s marked a period of significant social change in the United States, with new generations of African Americans rising to prominence in fields such as literature, arts, politics, and social justice. The Harlem Renaissance, which celebrated black culture and intellectualism, was in full swing, and Wells saw the fruits of her advocacy in the growing number of black intellectuals, artists, and leaders who were beginning to reshape the narrative around African American identity and potential. But while she took pride in this cultural blossoming, she also recognized that there was still much work to be done in the fight for racial equality. Wells' health continued to decline in her later years, and the physical toll of her decades of activism began to take its toll. She was often ill and struggled with the emotional burden of confronting the injustices of her time. Despite this, Wells remained committed to her advocacy, continuing to write, speak, and organize when she could. However, by the mid-1920s, she'd largely withdrawn from the day-to-day struggles of activism, leaving the next generation of leaders to continue her work. Even as her personal involvement waned, she continued to be a mentor and a guiding figure for the civil rights activists who followed in her footsteps. Throughout her life, Wells had always placed the greatest importance on justice and truth. She believed in the power of the written word to expose systemic inequality, and her extensive body of journalistic work continued to serve as a blueprint for later activists. Her powerful exposés on lynching, particularly her pamphlets Southern Horrors and A Red Record, became essential texts for those advocating for the end of racial violence and the protection of black lives. These works not only educated the public on the devastating effects of lynching, but also challenged the wider cultural narratives that perpetuated racial violence. As she watched the ongoing fight for civil rights unfold, Wells often found herself grappling with the limitations of the progress made during her lifetime. The brutal reality of lynching and racial violence had not been eradicated, and while the Harlem Renaissance was a sign of cultural vitality, it did not shield black Americans from the harsh realities of segregation and disenfranchisement. The fight for equality was far from over, and Wells understood that the movement needed to continue to evolve and grow. While Wells was not able to see the full fruits of the civil rights movement in her lifetime, her legacy set the foundation for the work that would take place in the years to come. She had fought for federal anti-lynching legislation, the enfranchisement of black women, and the inclusion of African Americans in the larger political, social, and economic spheres of the country. Her unflinching commitment to racial justice and gender equality laid the groundwork for the future movements that would achieve the legal victories that defined the mid-20th century. In the later years of her life, Wells became a symbolic figure for many of the civil rights leaders who emerged in the 1930s and beyond. Her willingness to speak out against injustice, her uncompromising stance on racial violence, and her advocacy for black women became the cornerstone of the modern civil rights movement. Wells' insistence on the inclusion of black women, her recognition of the intersectionality of race and gender, and her belief in the transformative power of activism would resonate strongly with the new generation of civil rights leaders, including figures like Rosa Parks, Ella Baker, and later, the broader student-led movements of the 1960s. As she entered the final years of her life, Wells also focused on preserving her legacy. She began to write about her experiences, thus reflecting on the challenges and triumphs of her decades of activism. She hoped that by sharing her story, future generations of activists would learn from her mistakes, successes, and unyielding dedication to the cause of justice. Wells recognized that while her work was not complete, she had played an essential role in changing the narrative around race and gender in America, and she was determined to ensure that her contributions would not be forgotten. Despite the physical challenges that accompanied her declining health, Wells continued to serve as a powerful symbol of resistance against injustice. In her final years, she continued to be sought out by younger activists for guidance and advice. She believed that the fight for civil rights was not just for the present generation, but for the generations that would come after. Her work inspired a deep sense of urgency in those who followed her, driving them to continue her efforts to challenge racial violence, inequality, and the systems that maintained white supremacy. Wells passed away in 1931, but the impact of her activism continued to reverberate throughout the civil rights movement. The victories of the 1950s and 1960s, such as the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, were the culmination of decades of work that had been inspired by the work of Wells and other early activists. Though Wells did not live to see these victories, her legacy played a central role in making them possible. Ida B. Wells was a trailblazer whose influence on American society transcended her time. She was not only a journalist, but also a fierce activist, a suffragist and a champion of civil rights. Her commitment to justice, her unyielding fight against lynching, and her refusal to let the truth be obscured by myths or lies made her one of the most impactful figures in American history. While her lifetime was filled with personal hardships, sacrifices, and at times overwhelming challenges, Wells's legacy lives on in the struggles for racial equality, gender justice, and human dignity that continue to this day. Wells's early works laid the foundation for the civil rights movement, and her brave reporting and advocacy shaped the way people thought about race and violence in America. Her groundbreaking exposés on lynching were not just journalistic feats. They were acts of resistance that forced the nation to confront the brutal realities of racial violence. At a time when lynching was rampant and largely ignored by the public, Wells shone a light on its systemic nature, offering irrefutable evidence of its existence, its motivations, and its consequences. She did so with courage and conviction, knowing that the consequences of speaking out could be deadly. Her commitment to racial justice extended far beyond her work on lynching. Wells was also a staunch advocate for the rights of black women, and she was one of the first to recognize the intersectionality of race and gender. She understood that black women were uniquely oppressed by both the racist and sexist systems of American society, and she worked tirelessly to ensure that their voices were included in the larger fight for equality. In doing so, Wells was not only fighting for her own freedom, but for the freedom of generations of black women who came after her. Wells' refusal to be silenced, her refusal to conform to the roles that society expected of her, made her a radical figure in her time. She was not afraid to challenge both the white establishment and even her own community when necessary. She challenged black men who, despite fighting for their own rights, often failed to address the struggles of black women. She also pushed back against the white suffrage movement, demanding that black women be included and recognized in the fight for the right to vote. Her vision of equality was comprehensive, recognizing that true justice required the inclusion of all people, particularly those who'd been most marginalized. Despite facing significant opposition, Wells became an inspiration to future generations of activists. Her work as a journalist paved the way for others to use their platforms for social change, and her advocacy for black women helped to lay the groundwork for the feminist movements that would follow. She was a precursor to the civil rights and feminist movements of the 20th century, and is often considered one of the most influential women in American history. Her influence can be seen in the activism of the 1950s and 1960s, particularly in the rise of the civil rights movement. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and other key leaders were deeply influenced by Wells' work. Her unapologetic stance against injustice and her ability to bring national attention to issues of racial violence helped to create the political climate that would lead to the passage of key civil rights legislation. Wells' legacy is also felt in the feminist movements of the 20th century, where her advocacy for black women's rights and her recognition of the intersectionality of race and gender were vital in shaping modern feminist thought. In more recent years, Wells's legacy has continued to inspire social justice movements, especially in the context of racial justice. The Black Lives Matter movement, which emerged in the 21st century, echoes many of the same demands that Wells made in her lifetime: an end to racial violence, justice for black victims of state-sponsored violence, and the acknowledgement of black people's humanity. Her calls for an inclusive movement that recognizes the specific challenges faced by black women remain as relevant today as they were during her lifetime. The ongoing struggles for racial justice, women's rights, and equality reflect the unfinished work that Wells started over a century ago. Her legacy is not just one of personal achievement, but one of collective empowerment. Wells' life and work remind us that social change is a long and difficult process, but that it is possible through dedication, courage, and the refusal to accept the status quo. She showed that one person, armed with truth and an unshakable commitment to justice, could make a difference. And her impact, felt across generations, proves that her work was not just a historical moment, but a movement that continues to evolve and inspire. Though Wells passed away in 1931, her legacy has continued to inspire scholars, activists, and everyday people who believe in the fight for justice and equality. Her name, once known primarily within African American activist circles, has become synonymous with the struggle for civil rights, and her contributions to journalism and social change are now widely recognized. Wells' ability to stand up against tyranny, to expose the injustices that others were too afraid to confront, and to give voice to the voiceless, made her an enduring symbol of resistance, resilience, and hope. Today, we continue to build upon the foundation Wells laid. Her work in exposing the horrors of lynching and advocating for racial justice serves as a model for those who still fight against systemic oppression. Her tireless commitment to the rights of black women and her advocacy for their inclusion in both the civil rights and feminist movements have made her a central figure in the modern struggle for equality. As we reflect on Wells' life and legacy, we're reminded that the fight for racial justice and equality is ongoing. The challenges that Wells faced, racism, sexism, and violence, continue to persist in different forms, but her example remains an inspiring call to action. She was a pioneer in the fight for racial and gender equality, and her work continues to resonate in the movements of today, reminding us all of the power of one person's voice to change the world. Ida B. Wells' legacy is one of courage, commitment, and undying faith in the possibility of a more just and equitable society. As long as the struggle for racial justice and equality continues, Wells' work and her example will remain a guiding light for all who fight for freedom and dignity.